Hello there and welcome to Life Beyond Scene, where we slow down, sit quietly with the world, and follow the stories that changed how humanity understood the place it lives in. There is a particular kind of journey, and not many of them exist really, that does something strange and permanent, not just to the person making it, but to the whole shape of human knowledge. A journey where someone walks out into the world with open eyes and comes back carrying ideas that rearrange everything that came before them. Most expeditions add to the map. A rare few redraw it entirely. Tonight we're going to follow one of those rare ones. We're going to go back to the very beginning of the 19th century, to a wooden ship sitting in a Spanish harbour, to a 29-year-old Prussian aristocrat with an extraordinary mind and an almost reckless amount of curiosity. And we're going to trace what happened when he sailed away from everything he knew and spent 5 years reading the natural world as if it were a single, living, breathing sentence. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something small. Where are you listening from tonight? What does the world look like outside your window right now? Is it dark and quiet, maybe a little cold, the kind of night where the air feels still and the only sounds are distant ones? Or is it warm where you are, the window open? Something moving gently in the trees. I always find it interesting to think about the people listening from different corners of the world, different climates, different hours of the night or morning, all following the same story through the same quiet voice. Whatever your corner looks like right now, I hope it is comfortable. This is a long one and it is worth settling into properly. If you enjoy what we do here at Life Beyond Scene, a like on this video and a subscription to the channel go a long way. They help more people find their way to these stories, and they let us keep making them. It takes a long time to put something like this together carefully, and knowing that people are listening and finding value in it genuinely matters. So if you feel moved to, please do, and thank you sincerely to everyone who already has. Now, June the 5th, 1799, the port of La Coruña, on the northwestern coast of Spain. The harbour would have been loud in the way old ports always were. Ropes, timber, the smell of salt and tar, men moving cargo, the particular kind of organised chaos that surrounds any ship preparing to leave on a long voyage. The Pizarro was not a large vessel by the standards of the era. She was a Spanish corvette, built for the kind of ocean crossings that were ordinary enough to the Spanish Navy, but still carried real risk in 1799. Yellow fever was circulating in the ports. The Atlantic crossing was not a casual thing, and yet among the people boarding that ship was a young man who had been waiting for this moment, in one form or another, for most of his adult life. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm Heinrich Alexander von Humboldt. He was 29 years old. He was Prussian, from a family of minor aristocracy, the kind of background that came with good education, good connections, and certain expectations about how a life ought to be organised. He had dark eyes and a compact, energetic frame, and by all accounts he moved through the world with a kind of focused restlessness that made people around him either fascinated or slightly exhausted. He carried with him an almost absurd quantity of scientific instruments: barometers, thermometers, telescopes, a chronometer, a cyanometer for measuring the blueness of the sky, a device for testing the magnetic intensity of the Earth. He had more instruments, in fact, than most ships of the era would have carried as standard equipment. He had packed for a serious purpose. Beside him was Aimé Bonpland, French, 30 years old, trained as a botanist and physician, and in many ways Humboldt's ideal companion, patient, methodical, deeply skilled, and willing to follow a man with an almost alarming level of ambition into places that had no reliable maps. The two had met in Paris the previous year, and whatever chemistry exists between people who are exactly right for a shared endeavour, they had it. Bonpland would go on to collect somewhere in the range of 60,000 plant specimens over the course of the expedition. Not all of them, obviously, on the first day. But you get the sense of the man. The ship sailed on June the 5th. The destination was Spanish colonial South America, a vast, largely unmapped, biologically staggering region that very few European scientists had ever been permitted to enter. Permission to go there was not something that was simply granted. The Spanish colonial system was famously protective of its territories, suspicious of foreign observers, and not especially interested in making things easy for Prussian naturalists with notebooks. That Humboldt had obtained permission at all was itself a kind of small miracle, one we will come to properly in a moment. But standing on the deck of the Pizarro as La Coruña fell away behind him, Humboldt was not thinking about the bureaucratic difficulty of getting here. He was thinking about what was ahead. He had been thinking about it for years. The forests, the mountains, the rivers, the volcanoes, the sheer living density of a continent that European science had barely touched. He had read everything available, the accounts of La Condamine's 1743 journey, the botanical work that had come before, the fragmentary geographical reports. He had studied maps that were partly guesswork. He'd stared at illustrations of plants and animals that seemed almost too vivid to be real. And now the ship was moving, and the harbour was behind him, and the Atlantic was ahead. There is something worth pausing on here, which is who this man actually was and what he came from. Because the image of a wealthy young aristocrat sailing off on a scientific adventure sounds, on the surface, like a particular kind of comfortable story. But Humboldt's path to this ship was not straightforward, and understanding it changes how the expedition itself feels. He had grown up in Berlin and at the family estate at Tegel, outside the city. His father died when Alexander was 9. His mother, Marie Elizabeth, was a cold and dutiful woman who oversaw her son's education with rigour but little warmth. His brother Wilhelm, 2 years older, became a philosopher and linguist of considerable distinction, one of the great intellectual figures of his era, actually. Alexander's education was thorough and wide, languages, mathematics, natural history, economics, but he was restless in a way that formal education could not quite contain. He wanted to be outside. He wanted to look at rocks and plants and weather patterns. He wanted to understand how the world actually worked, not just how it was described in books. What he eventually found in 1791 was the Freiburg Mining Academy in Saxony, where he studied under Abraham Gottlob Werner, one of the era's leading geologists. Werner believed that rock formations could be read systematically, that the Earth had a legible history if you knew how to look. Humboldt absorbed this completely, and then went further with it, spending months doing actual underground fieldwork in the mines of Franconia, mapping geological strata, studying the health effects of mine gases on workers, developing his eye for the kind of careful, patient observation that would define the rest of his life. He was not content to theorize. He wanted to be in the mine, in the dark, with a rock in front of him. Then, in 1796, his mother died. She left him an inheritance of approximately 90,000 thalers, a very substantial sum. It was by a grim irony that he seems to have recognized the thing that made everything possible. He had financial independence now. He did not need to take a government post or follow a conventional path. He could, if he could arrange the necessary permissions, go somewhere extraordinary. He tried first to join a French scientific expedition that was being organised in the late 1790s. It fell apart before it began. He made his way to Paris, which was in those years the intellectual centre of the world, full of scientists, philosophers, explorers, and people arguing about everything with tremendous energy. It was there that he met Bonpland, and it was there that his plans began to take a more definite shape. He had been reading about Chimborazo, a massive volcano in what is now Ecuador, then believed to be the highest mountain on Earth. The idea of it had lodged in his imagination in a way that would not let go. He wanted to climb it. More than that, he wanted to understand the entire natural system of which it was a part. What is important to understand about Humboldt, and this is something that sets him apart from many scientists of his era, is that he did not want to simply collect specimens and bring them home. He was not interested in nature as a cabinet of curiosities. He believed, with a conviction that was almost philosophical, that the natural world was not a collection of separate things, but a single interconnected system, and that the job of the scientist was to perceive those connections, to feel them as well as measure them. He used the word feeling deliberately. He thought that science and aesthetic experience were not opposites, that looking at a mountain and being moved by it, and measuring its altitude and analysing its geology were all part of the same act of understanding. This was not a common view in 1799. It would become enormously influential. He also had money, and he was prepared to spend it. The expedition would eventually cost him the majority of his inheritance. He paid for the instruments, the travel, the preservation of specimens, the salaries of assistants. He paid later for decades of publication. He essentially spent his fortune on the project of understanding the world, which is either inspiring or slightly alarming depending on your relationship with financial caution. Humboldt seems to have found it straightforwardly obvious. What else would you do with it? So the Pizarro sailed. The two men stood on the deck and watched the Spanish coast disappear. Humboldt was 29 years old. He had his instruments and his notebooks and his companion and his inheritance and his enormous, restless, organised curiosity about the living planet. He had no way of knowing that he would not see Europe again for 5 years. He had no real way of knowing what was waiting for him. The rivers and mountains and electrical eels and altitude sickness and fever, and the greatest climb any human had yet attempted, and the cold current in the Pacific, and the meetings with presidents and botanists and indigenous communities, and the decades of work that would follow. What he knew, standing on that ship in June of 1799, was that he was finally going, and that the Earth, in all its layered, connected, living complexity, was waiting to be read. But before the continent could reveal itself to him, there was still the matter of how he had gotten permission to go there at all, because that story is its own small piece of history, and it tells you something about the world Humboldt was sailing into. Spanish colonial America in 1799 was not a place you simply sailed into with a notebook and a set of barometers. The Spanish Empire had spent nearly 3 centuries carefully controlling who entered its territories in the New World, and the reasons were not complicated. It was an empire built on extraction, on silver and gold and sugar and labour, and the last thing the colonial administration in Madrid wanted was a well-connected European scientist wandering around its most valuable possessions, writing down everything he observed. Foreign scientists were, by definition, potential spies, potential agitators, potential competitors. The British had been probing the edges of Spanish America for decades. The French were not much more welcome. The general rule was simple: you did not get in. Humboldt understood this. He had been reading everything he could find about South America for years, and he knew that even well-credentialed Europeans had struggled to gain access. Charles-Marie de la Condamine, the French mathematician who had gone to measure the shape of the Earth near the equator in the 1730s, had navigated the Orinoco and Amazon but had done so under extremely constrained conditions, watched closely by Spanish officials at every step. The botanical expeditions that Spain had occasionally authorized, Mutis in New Granada, Sese in Mexico, were led by scientists working under royal appointment, essentially employees of the crown. A Prussian aristocrat arriving with his own money and his own agenda was a different proposition entirely. So Humboldt went to Madrid. This was in early 1799, and it was not a short or easy process. He had to navigate the Spanish court at a moment when Spain was in an awkward political position. It had recently been forced into a closer alliance with Napoleonic France, and the king, Charles IV, was a man of limited intellectual curiosity who was largely managed by his minister, Mariano Luis de Urquijo. Humboldt had letters of introduction, as any well-connected aristocrat of the era would, and he used them carefully. He was charming in a way that could be quite deliberate when he needed it to be. He spoke several languages, he knew how to talk to powerful people, and he was genuinely interested in almost everything, which made him good company. What he was after was a passport, not just a travel document, but a royal authorization, a cedula, that would instruct Spanish colonial officials throughout the Americas to give him free passage, access to whatever he needed, and cooperation rather than obstruction. It was an extraordinary thing to ask for, and by most accounts he should not have gotten it, but he did. The exact reasons are a little unclear even now. Urquijo seems to have been genuinely sympathetic, and there may have been a sense in Madrid that having a famous European scientist publicly undertaking a scientific expedition in Spanish territory was actually good for the empire's image at a moment when that image was under pressure. Whatever the reasoning, Humboldt walked out of Madrid in the spring of 1799 with one of the most permissive travel documents ever issued to a foreign visitor in the history of Spanish colonial America. It gave him access to all Spanish territories in the New World. It instructed local officials to assist him. It was, in practical terms, a remarkable piece of paper. He and Bonpland made their way to La Coruña, on the northwestern coast of Spain, where the Pizarro was waiting. And it is worth pausing on this moment, because the departure itself was almost delayed by something that had nothing to do with politics. A typhus epidemic had broken out in the region, and there were serious concerns about whether the ship would be allowed to sail. Humboldt characteristically used the delay to observe things. He measured the local geology. He noted the vegetation. He was constitutionally incapable of wasting time. When the Pizarro finally sailed on June 5th, 1799, it did not go directly to South America. The ship's route took it south toward the Canary Islands, and Humboldt had been hoping for this. He wanted to stop at Tenerife, the largest of the islands, because Tenerife had Taida. Taida is a volcano. At 3,715 metres, it was at the time considered one of the great natural landmarks of the Atlantic world, and Humboldt had been reading about it since he was a young man. The ship stopped at Santa Cruz de Tenerife, and Humboldt and Bonpland climbed it. This climb, which lasted several days and took them through multiple distinct vegetation zones, from the subtropical coastline up through pine forests and then into the bare volcanic rock near the summit, was actually a preview in miniature of what the entire expedition would become. Humboldt was already doing the thing that would define his scientific method, noticing that as you went higher, the plants changed in predictable ways, that temperature and humidity and the character of the soil all shifted together, that altitude was not just a number on a barometer, but a whole set of ecological conditions that shaped life in systematic ways. He was making notes about all of it. Bonpland was collecting specimens. They were working, even on what could have been simply a sightseeing stop. The typhus that had threatened to delay the departure from La Coruña had not entirely stayed behind. During the Atlantic crossing, the disease broke out among the passengers and crew of the Pizarro. This was not unusual for the era. Ships in 1799 were not healthy environments, and Atlantic crossings were routinely dangerous in ways that went well beyond the weather. People died of illness on these voyages regularly. Humboldt and Bonpland were exposed. They were fortunate enough not to become seriously ill at this stage, though the threat was real and the conditions on board were grim for a period. Several passengers were not so lucky. The crossing took roughly 6 weeks, which was fairly standard, and then, on July 16th, 1799, the Pizarro arrived at Cumaná, on the northeastern coast of what is now Venezuela. It was the first landfall in the New World. Humboldt was 29 years old, and he had been planning for this moment in one way or another for the better part of a decade. What he found when he stepped off the ship was something that no amount of reading had fully prepared him for. He wrote about it later with a kind of overwhelmed precision. The quality of the light, the density of the vegetation, the sounds, the heat, the sheer biological richness of everything around him. He had been in forests before, obviously. He had worked in mines and climbed mountains and travelled widely in Europe. But tropical South America was categorically different from anything in his experience. The diversity was staggering. He later described feeling, in those first days at Cumaná, that he could not take in fast enough what was around him, that every step revealed something new, that the plants and insects and birds were so numerous and so various that the mind struggled to organise them. He also noticed very quickly that Cumaná had recently been damaged by an earthquake. The city showed the marks of it clearly: cracked walls, collapsed structures, the kind of evidence that tells a geologist something about the forces operating beneath the surface. Humboldt began documenting this immediately, asking local people about the timing and character of the tremors, examining the damage patterns, thinking about what it meant for the geological structure of the region. He was not there for a day before he was working. The weeks at Cumaná were the beginning of what would become an almost incomprehensible volume of data collection. Humboldt had brought with him an extensive set of scientific instruments: barometers, thermometers, chronometers, a cyanometer for measuring the blueness of the sky, a magnetometer for measuring the intensity of the Earth's magnetic field, instruments for measuring humidity and the chemical composition of air. Every day, at set intervals, he took readings: temperature, humidity, barometric pressure, magnetic intensity, all of it recorded, all of it dated and noted with the location. He was, in a sense, building a continuous scientific record of everywhere he went, a portrait of the atmosphere and the Earth at every point along his route. No one had done anything quite like this before, at least not at this scale and with this consistency. Bonpland, meanwhile, was collecting plants. The numbers are almost difficult to believe. By the end of the expedition, he and Humboldt together would bring back around 60,000 plant specimens, of which roughly 6,000 were species previously unknown to European science. In those early weeks at Cumaná, Bonpland was already filling boxes. He was a methodical and capable botanist, and the tropical flora around Cumaná was, from his perspective, essentially inexhaustible. There was more to collect than two people could possibly collect. They did their best. From Cumaná, they moved inland. The route took them toward the llanos, the vast flat grasslands that stretch across a huge portion of northern South America, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers of open savanna, flooded in the wet season and baked dry in the dry season, home to enormous herds of cattle and an extraordinary range of wildlife. The llanos were not dramatic in the way that mountains or rainforests are dramatic. They were flat and hot, and in the dry season they shimmered with heat haze, and they went on and on in every direction. But Humboldt found them fascinating in a different way. They were a landscape of extremes, of seasonal transformation, of life adapted to conditions that swung wildly between abundance and scarcity. It was in the Llanos that one of the most famous episodes of the entire expedition took place. Humboldt had been reading about electric eels, Electrophorus electricus, though the taxonomy of the era was somewhat different, and he was determined to study them properly. The local people knew exactly where to find them, in certain pools and slow-moving waterways. The challenge was obtaining specimens without being shocked into unconsciousness, which was a real risk. The electric eel is not a small animal. It can reach 2 meters in length, and its discharge, which can exceed 600 volts, is capable of stunning a horse. The method the local people used was vivid and effective, if somewhat alarming to watch. They drove a herd of horses and mules into the pool where the eels were known to live. The animals thrashed and panicked. The eels, disturbed and threatened, discharged repeatedly. Great bursts of electrical energy delivered through the water. Several of the horses were actually killed. Others stumbled and nearly drowned. But after a period of this, the eels were exhausted. They could not discharge indefinitely. The electrical organs need time to recover, and repeated discharging depletes them. Once the eels were spent, the local fishermen waded in and collected them with wooden poles, and Humboldt and Bonpland were able to handle them and examine them. Humboldt described the experience in considerable detail in his later writings. He noted the precise sensation of the shock, working up from the hands through the arms, affecting the joints, producing a numbness that lasted for some time. He was not simply observing from a safe distance. He held the eels. He measured them. He thought carefully about the mechanism by which they produced and directed electrical charge, and he connected his observations to what was then a very new field of inquiry, the relationship between electricity and living organisms, which Galvani and Volta had recently been exploring in Europe. Humboldt was not just collecting a curiosity. He was trying to understand how electricity worked in biological systems, which was a genuinely open question in 1800. The Llanos also gave him something else, a sense of the sheer scale of the continent he was moving through. Standing in that flat, enormous landscape, measuring the temperature of the air and the soil at different times of day, watching the way the heat built and the light changed, Humboldt was beginning to develop the ideas about climate and geography that would eventually become some of his most important contributions. He was noticing that temperature was not simply a function of latitude, that altitude, proximity to the ocean, the character of the land surface, all of these things shaped local climate in ways that were systematic and mappable. He was thinking, in other words, about what we would now call climatology, though the word did not yet exist. The daily routine of the expedition during this period was demanding in a way that is easy to underestimate when you read the published accounts. They were travelling in a region that was, in many places, without roads in any meaningful sense. They moved by mule, by canoe, on foot. The heat was extreme. The insects were constant. Humboldt wrote about the mosquitoes of the Llanos with a mixture of scientific precision and barely concealed exhaustion, noting that the clouds of insects were so dense in certain areas that it was difficult to breathe without inhaling them. They slept in conditions that range from basic to genuinely harsh. They ate what was available, and through all of it, Humboldt was taking measurements, making notes, asking questions of everyone he met, missionaries, traders, indigenous guides, local farmers, and Bonpland was collecting, pressing, labelling, preserving. The volume of work they were producing daily is honestly a little staggering to contemplate. Humboldt was not a man who rested easily when there was something to observe, and in the Llanos there was always something to observe. But even the Llanos, vast as they were not the central scientific drama of the Venezuela phase of the expedition. That lay further ahead, up the great dark river that the indigenous people of the region called the Orinoco, and beyond it, a geographical question that had been puzzling European scientists for the better part of a century, waiting for someone to go and actually look. Getting permission to enter Spanish colonial territory was, in 1799, genuinely difficult. Not difficult in the way that bureaucratic processes are difficult, slow, frustrating, full of small obstacles, but difficult in a deeper, more structural sense. The Spanish crown had spent nearly 3 centuries carefully controlling who was allowed to move through its American possessions, and foreign scientists were precisely the kind of people the colonial administration was least interested in welcoming. The concern was not unfounded from the Spanish perspective. A foreign naturalist wandering through the colonies was also inevitably a foreign observer of colonial wealth, colonial geography, colonial vulnerabilities. The maps such a person might make, the resources they might document, the political observations they might record, all of this was information that could find its way to rival European powers. Spain had watched France and Britain expand their own colonial holdings for generations, and it was not inclined to hand them a detailed survey of its own territory out of goodwill towards science. There had been exceptions. The French geodesic expedition of the 1730s and 1740s, which travelled to what is now Ecuador to measure the shape of the Earth, had operated under a specific and carefully negotiated arrangement. But that had been a formal scientific mission with diplomatic backing. Humboldt was, by comparison, a private individual, a Prussian aristocrat with a passion for measurement and a large personal fortune. Prussia and Spain were not enemies, but they were not particularly close allies either, and the normal answer to a foreign traveller requesting access to the Spanish colonies was no. Humboldt arrived in Madrid in early 1799 and set about making the case for himself with considerable determination. He was not naive about the process. He understood that what he needed was not simply a travel permit, but a genuine endorsement from the Spanish crown, something that would open doors across the entire colonial system, from Venezuela to Peru to Mexico. Without that, he would be stopped at every colonial checkpoint, questioned, delayed, possibly turned back entirely. He needed something extraordinary. His approach was methodical. He sought introductions to the right people, and he found them. The key figure was Mariano Luis de Urquijo, who was at that time effectively the most powerful minister in the Spanish government, serving as Secretary of State under King Charles IV. Urquijo was not a scientist, but he was an educated man with Enlightenment sympathies, and Humboldt made his case carefully and persuasively. He explained what he intended to study, the instruments he would carry, the kind of knowledge he hoped to produce. He framed the expedition not as a foreign intrusion, but as something that could bring credit to Spain. A great scientific journey conducted under Spanish permission, documenting the natural wealth of Spanish territories for the benefit of human knowledge. It was a reasonable argument, and Urquijo was receptive to it. The result, after several weeks of meetings and negotiations, was remarkable. The passport Humboldt received from the Spanish crown was one of the most permissive documents ever granted to a foreign traveller in Spanish America. It gave him access not just to one region, but to all Spanish colonies. It authorised him to use Spanish ships, to call upon colonial governors for assistance, to move freely through territories that were normally closed to outsiders. Colonial officials were instructed to cooperate with him. It was, in practical terms, an almost unprecedented level of access, and it reflected both Humboldt's persistence and Urquijo's genuine support for what the expedition might accomplish. With the passport secured, Humboldt and Bonpland moved quickly. They had already spent months waiting, and the season was advancing. They made their way to La Coruña, on the Atlantic coast of northwestern Spain, where the Pizarro was being prepared for departure. The ship was a Spanish corvette, not a dedicated scientific vessel. It was a working naval ship that happened to be sailing to the Americas, and Humboldt and Bonpland were passengers aboard it, along with their enormous quantity of equipment. The instruments alone were considerable: sextants, a chronometer, barometers, thermometers, a magnetometer for measuring the Earth's magnetic field, electrometers, devices for measuring the chemical composition of the atmosphere. Humboldt had spent a significant portion of his inheritance on these instruments, acquiring the best available examples from the finest makers in Europe. He intended to measure everything, and he intended to measure it accurately. They sailed on June 5th, 1799. The Atlantic in early summer was not particularly kind to them. Within a few days of departure, illness broke out aboard the Pizarro. The disease was typhus, or at least what the ship's doctor believed to be typhus, and it moved through the crew and passengers with the efficiency that confined quarters and close contact always permit. Several people became seriously ill. The question of whether to turn back arose, as it would in any sensible person's mind when a potentially fatal disease appears on a ship in the middle of the ocean. Humboldt and Bonpland were not immune to the anxiety of the situation, but they were also not inclined to abandon the expedition at the first serious obstacle. They had worked too long and waited too long for this. They continued. The Pizarro made a stop at Tenerife, in the Canary Islands, which was a common waypoint for ships crossing to the Americas. It was here that Humboldt had his first encounter with a significant volcanic landscape, and characteristically he could not simply observe it from a distance. He climbed it. The Teide volcano, which rises to 3,715 metres above sea level and dominates the island entirely, was a natural target for someone who had been thinking about volcanic geology since his days in the mines of Franconia. The climb took the better part of a day. Humboldt made careful measurements at various altitudes: temperature, atmospheric pressure, the composition of volcanic gases near the summit. He observed the vegetation changing as he gained elevation, noting how the plant community shifted from the subtropical growth of the lower slopes through a zone of pine forest, and then into the sparse cold vegetation near the summit, and finally into the bare volcanic rock of the crater rim. This was not simply a pleasant hike. It was an observation, carefully conducted, and it planted a seed in Humboldt's thinking about the relationship between altitude and life, a seed that would grow into one of his most important ideas over the years ahead. Coming back down from Teide, he was already thinking about what the Andes might look like. If a single island volcano showed such clear patterns of vegetation by altitude, what would the great mountain chains of South America reveal? The Pizarro resumed its crossing. The typhus continued to trouble the ship, though the worst of it seemed to have passed. The Atlantic in July is a different ocean from the Atlantic in June. Hotter, the air heavier, the trade winds carrying a warmth that felt, to a European who had grown up in the cool northern climate of Prussia, almost physical in its presence. Humboldt was measuring continuously the temperature of the air, the temperature of the water, the colour of the sea at different depths, the magnetic intensity of the earth as the ship moved south and west. He was building a picture of the Atlantic as a physical system, a body of water with its own patterns of temperature and current and chemistry, not simply an empty space between continents. They arrived at Cumaná, on the northeastern coast of what is now Venezuela, on July 16th, 1799. It had been 41 days since they left La Coruña. The moment of arrival in the tropics was something Humboldt described with a vividness that comes through clearly even in translation. The colours were different. The light was different. The smell of the vegetation coming off the land as the ship approached the coast was unlike anything he had encountered in Europe. Dense, complex, alive in a way that the temperate forests of Germany and France simply were not. He wrote later that he felt, in those first moments, a kind of sensory overwhelm that was not unpleasant but was genuinely difficult to process. Everything was new. Everything demanded attention. He did not know where to look first. Bonpland, who was a botanist by training and temperament, immediately began cataloguing. The plants around Cumaná were extraordinary in their variety. Hundreds of species within a short distance of the harbour, many of them completely unknown to European science. He was collecting specimens, pressing them, labelling them, noting their characteristics, almost from the moment he stepped off the ship. The pace of collection that he and Humboldt maintained in those first weeks in Venezuela gives some sense of the intensity with which they approached the work. They were not tourists pausing to admire the scenery. They were scientists in the middle of a landscape that was, from their perspective, almost incomprehensibly rich. Cumaná itself was a small colonial town, not large by European standards, but established, with a Spanish colonial administration, a cathedral, a harbour that handled trade along the Venezuelan coast. It had also been damaged by a significant earthquake some years before Humboldt's arrival, and the evidence of that damage was still visible in certain buildings and in the landscape around the town. Humboldt documented the earthquake damage carefully, interviewing local residents about what they had felt and seen, noting the direction of the tremors, the pattern of destruction. This was not incidental curiosity. He was building a picture of the geological character of the region, trying to understand the relationship between the volcanic activity of the Andes and the seismic instability of the Caribbean coast. Even in his first days in Venezuela, he was thinking about the continent as a system. The permission he carried from the Spanish crown proved its worth almost immediately. The colonial governor of Cumaná received them with a cooperation that would have been entirely absent without the royal passport. They were given assistance, introductions, access. The network of colonial administration, which might otherwise have been an obstacle, became instead a kind of infrastructure for the expedition, imperfect and sometimes slow but genuinely useful. Humboldt understood that the passport was not just a piece of paper. It was the thing that made the whole enterprise possible, and he was careful to maintain good relationships with colonial officials throughout the journey, even when his private opinions about the colonial system were considerably less favourable. They spent several weeks in and around Cumaná before beginning to move inland. The coastal region alone provided an enormous amount of material: geological observations, botanical collections, astronomical measurements to fix their precise location, atmospheric readings of temperature and humidity and barometric pressure. Humboldt was establishing a baseline. He wanted to know exactly where he was, in every measurable sense, before he began moving through the interior of the continent. The precision mattered to him. One of his consistent frustrations with the existing geographical knowledge of South America was how vague and inaccurate it was. Places were marked on maps at positions that were sometimes hundreds of kilometers from where they actually were. He intended to fix that, one careful measurement at a time. By the time they turned their attention toward the Llanos and the great river systems beyond, they had already accumulated more scientific data than many expeditions produced in their entirety, and they had barely begun. The coast of Venezuela was only the threshold. The interior of the continent, the grasslands, the rivers, the forests, the mountains, stretched out ahead of them in almost every direction, largely unknown to European science, full of questions that no one had yet thought to ask in the right way. Humboldt had thought of the questions. He had the instruments to pursue them. He had the permission to go wherever the answers might lead. What he was about to find, moving inland from Cumaná toward the vast and shimmering expanse of the Llanos, would exceed even his considerable expectations, and the strangest and most dramatic of it was still waiting for him in the dark water of a pool in the grasslands, coiled and patient and carrying enough electricity to stop a horse in its tracks. The Llanos of Venezuela are not what most people picture when they imagine South America. There are no jungles here, no towering canopy, no dense tangle of vines and shade. The Llanos is flat, genuinely, almost disturbingly flat, a vast interior grassland that stretches across roughly 300,000 square kilometers of Venezuela and Colombia, broken only by scattered palms and the slow wide rivers that cross it during the wet season. In the dry season, which is when Humboldt and Bonpland moved through it, the Llanos bakes under a sun that feels closer than it should. The ground cracks, the air shimmers. Animals cluster around whatever water remains. It is a landscape of extremes, and Humboldt found it fascinating in a way that was almost different in character from his fascination with the coast. He had not expected the Llanos to be beautiful exactly, but he found something in its scale that moved him. He wrote about the horizon in a way that suggests he had never truly seen a horizon before, that the forests of Europe, even the open countryside of Prussia, had always given the eye something to rest on. Here there was nothing. Just the flat earth and the enormous sky above it, and the strange sensation of being very small inside a very large space. He noted the quality of the light over the grassland in the late afternoon, the way the heat haze made distant objects appear to float above the ground, the silence that settled over the plains after the midday heat peaked and before the evening sounds of insects and birds began. He was not just measuring. He was paying attention in a way that was part scientific and part something harder to name. The journey inland from Cumaná had taken them through varied terrain, forested hills, dry scrubland, the gradual opening of the landscape as they moved west and south toward the great flat basin of the interior. They travelled on horseback and mule, which was the standard mode of transport in the region, and the conditions were not comfortable. The heat was persistent and serious. Water was a constant concern. The roads, such as they were, ranged from rough tracks to near impassable muddy paths, depending on where they were and what the recent weather had been. Humboldt took measurements constantly. He recorded the air temperature at regular intervals. He measured the humidity. He noted the plant species along the route, the character of the soil, the angle of the sun, the magnetic readings from his instruments. Bonpland collected specimens with the focused intensity of someone who understood that many of these plants had never been pressed and labelled and sent back to European herbaria before. They were, in a very literal sense, mapping the unknown. It was somewhere in this landscape, near the low pools and marshy areas that dotted the drier reaches of the Llanos, that Humboldt encountered what would become one of the most memorable and genuinely strange episodes of the entire expedition. He had heard about electric eels before leaving Europe. The existence of the Electrophorus electricus was known in a general way to natural historians, and there were accounts, somewhat vague and not entirely credible sounding, of a creature in the rivers of South America that could deliver an electric shock powerful enough to injure or kill. Humboldt was sceptical of some of the more dramatic claims, as he tended to be sceptical of dramatic claims in general, but he was deeply interested in the phenomenon itself. Electricity was a subject of intense scientific interest in the early 19th century. This was only a few decades after Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment, and the nature of electrical charge was still being actively worked out. A fish that generated its own electricity was not just a curiosity. It was a potentially important piece of a much larger puzzle. What happened next is one of those episodes that Humboldt described in his later writings with enough specific detail that you can picture it clearly even 2 centuries later. The local inhabitants of the Llanos knew how to catch electric eels, and they had a method that was effective, if somewhat dramatic in its approach. They drove horses and mules into the shallow pools where the eels lived. The animals, startled and frightened, churned through the water, and the eels, alarmed by the disturbance, discharged their electricity against the larger creatures. The horses reeled and stumbled, some collapsed into the water. The eels, after discharging repeatedly, became temporarily exhausted, their electrical capacity depleted. And in that window of exhaustion, when the eels were temporarily less dangerous, they could be caught. Humboldt watched this with the particular expression that one imagines on the face of a scientist, watching something both horrifying and extremely interesting. Several horses were badly shocked. 2 apparently died in the water, which he noted with the careful flatness of a man trying to stay objective about something that was clearly quite disturbing to witness. The eels themselves were large, some of them close to 2 meters in length, thick and muscular, moving through the murky water with an unhurried confidence that suggested they were not particularly worried about the horses. Once the eels had exhausted their charge and been pulled from the water, Humboldt and Bonpland were able to handle them. And handle them they did in the interest of science with predictable results. Humboldt described the sensation of touching an eel that had not fully recovered its charge. A sharp, deeply unpleasant shock that travelled up his arm and into his shoulder, leaving him with a numbness that persisted for some time. He touched it more than once. This is either admirable scientific dedication or a slightly alarming approach to personal safety, and it is probably both. What he was doing, beyond simply enduring an uncomfortable experience, was trying to understand the mechanism. He was asking how the eel produced the electricity, how it controlled the discharge, what the relationship was between the eel's nervous system and the electrical organ along its body. He did not have the instruments to fully answer these questions in the field, but he documented everything he could observe: the behaviour of the eels, the way they oriented themselves in the water, the apparent strength of different discharges, the recovery time between shocks. He took specimens, he made drawings, he brought the data back to the larger body of observation he was building about the natural systems of the continent. The electric eel experiment, as it became known, was not a stunt. It was a serious attempt to understand something that European science had not yet properly examined. And Humboldt's account of it, published years later, was one of the first rigorous scientific descriptions of Electrophorus electricus that European readers had access to. The Llanos also gave Humboldt something else, a sustained encounter with the climate and ecology of a tropical grassland over an extended period, which was different in important ways from the brief coastal observations he had made around Cumaná. He was tracking how temperature changed through the day, how the dry season affected the distribution of animals and plants, how the flat terrain influenced wind patterns and humidity. He was watching the Llanos as a system, not just as a backdrop. He noticed the way certain bird species gathered around the remaining water sources as the dry season deepened. He noted the behaviour of the capybaras, the large semi-aquatic rodents that moved through the grassland in groups, and the caimans that lay motionless in the shallower pools. He was interested in the relationships between species, not just the species themselves, which was, for the time, a genuinely unusual way of thinking about natural history. Bonpland, meanwhile, was working at a pace that was almost difficult to keep up with in the telling. The Llanos were not as botanically rich as the coastal forests, but they had their own flora, grasses, palms, flowering plants adapted to the heat and drought, and Bonpland was collecting and pressing specimens of everything he could reach. By this point in the expedition, they had already accumulated hundreds of plant specimens, many of them new to European science. The logistics of managing this collection while also travelling through difficult terrain were considerable. Specimens had to be properly dried and pressed, labelled with their location and date of collection, packed carefully enough to survive the journey to the coast and eventually the long sea voyage back to Europe. It was painstaking work, done in conditions that were far from ideal, and the fact that the collection survived at all, and eventually reached Paris largely intact, is a testament to how seriously Bonpland took the task. The daily rhythm of the expedition in the Llanos was something Humboldt described in enough detail to give a sense of what the work actually felt like from the inside. They rose early, before the worst of the heat, and travelled or collected in the cooler morning hours. Midday was often too hot for comfortable outdoor work, and they would rest if shelter was available, which it often was not. In the evenings, Humboldt would record the day's observations, make his astronomical measurements to fix their position, take the final temperature and humidity readings of the day, and write up his notes in the journals that were filling up steadily as the weeks passed. He slept when conditions allowed, but the insects of the Llanos were a persistent problem. Mosquitoes, gnats, and biting flies were present in numbers that he described as genuinely oppressive. Not a minor inconvenience, but a constant physical burden that wore on the travellers over time. He was not complaining exactly, he was documenting. But the documentation makes clear that the expedition was not a comfortable experience, even in its less dramatic moments. What strikes you, reading about these weeks in the Llanos, is the sheer volume of data being generated. Every day produced new measurements, new specimens, new observations, new questions. Humboldt was not simply recording what he saw. He was comparing it to what he had seen the day before, and the week before, and to what he had read in the accounts of earlier travellers. He was building a picture, layer by layer, of how this part of the continent worked, its climate, its geology, its biology, the way all of these things related to each other. He was thinking about the Llanos as a place that could only be fully understood in relation to the mountains to the west, the rivers that crossed it, the ocean to the north, the forests to the south. Everything connected to everything else. That was the idea that was forming in his mind slowly and persistently through every week of the expedition. He also found time in the Llanos to think about the people who lived there. The Llaneros, the cattle herders of the Venezuelan plains, were a tough, independent group who had developed a way of life precisely adapted to the extreme conditions of the grassland. Humboldt observed them with the same careful attention he gave to everything else, noting their methods of managing cattle across the vast open range, their knowledge of the landscape, their relationship with the difficult climate. He was interested in how human communities adapted to their environments, not just in the abstract, but in the specific practical details of how people actually lived. This was part of what made his work different from that of many other natural historians of the period. He did not treat the human world as separate from the natural world. They were part of the same system, and you could not fully understand one without the other. By the time Humboldt and Bonpland were ready to move on from the Llanos and turn their attention toward the river systems to the south, they had been in Venezuela for several months. The coast, the hills, the earthquake-damaged streets of Cumaná, the vast flat grassland and its strange electric inhabitants. All of it was documented, measured, pressed and packed. The notebooks were dense with observations. The specimen cases were heavy with plants and rocks and preserved animals. And ahead of them, moving south and east through the interior of the continent, lay the Orinoco, one of the great rivers of South America, still largely unmapped, still holding at its heart a geographical question that had been debated in European scientific circles for decades without a definitive answer. Whether the Orinoco and the Amazon were connected by a natural waterway, whether water from one great system could flow through some channel in the forest into the other, was the kind of question that sounded almost like a rumour, the kind of thing that turned up in travellers' accounts without ever being properly confirmed. Humboldt intended to find out for himself, which meant going into the river, into the forest, into the insects and the heat and the illness, and looking. The staging point for the Orinoco journey was a small settlement called San Fernando de Apure, sitting at the confluence of the Apure and Orinoco rivers in the interior of Venezuela. It was not a large or particularly comfortable place, a scattering of buildings at the edge of an enormous wilderness, but it was the last real settlement they would pass through before the river took them deep into territory that most Europeans had never seen and few had described in any reliable way. Humboldt and Bonpland arrived there in late March of 1800, loaded their supplies into a long dugout canoe, and set off into one of the least known river systems on the continent. The Orinoco is not a small river. It is one of the longest in South America, draining an enormous basin that stretches across Venezuela and into Colombia, and in the wet season, which was approaching as they travelled, it spreads far beyond its banks into the surrounding forest, turning the landscape into something that is neither river nor land but an uncertain, flooded world in between. The canoe they were travelling in was roughly 12 metres long, made from a single hollowed tree trunk, and it carried Humboldt, Bonpland, their instruments, their specimen cases, their food supplies, and a small crew of local paddlers who knew the river in a way that no map could convey. It was not a comfortable vessel for a journey of this length, and it offered essentially no shelter from the sun, the rain, or the insects. The insects deserve their own moment of attention here, because Humboldt wrote about them with a specificity that makes clear they were not a minor footnote to the journey. The mosquitoes of the Orinoco basin were present in what he described as clouds, not a figure of speech, but a fairly literal description of what it looked like when they rose from the riverbanks and the flooded forest at dusk. He wrote that the air near the river's edge was thick with them, that breathing required care, that sleep was nearly impossible without some kind of smoke to drive them back, and that the local people had developed elaborate methods of managing the problem that the European travellers had to learn quickly or suffer considerably. Both Humboldt and Bonpland suffered anyway. By the time the journey was over, both men were ill, their skin was in poor condition from weeks of biting, and the physical toll of the river was visible in ways that photographs would have captured clearly if photographs had existed. Humboldt characteristically documented the insects as carefully as everything else. Their species, their behaviour, the times of day when they were most active, the way different stretches of the river produced different densities of them. He was miserable, and he was taking notes about being miserable, which is perhaps one of the more endearing qualities of the man. The heat was the other constant. The Orinoco Basin in the wet season is not simply warm. It is a sustained, wet, enveloping heat that settles into everything and does not lift even at night. Humboldt was measuring temperatures throughout the journey, and his readings along the river frequently exceeded 35 degrees Celsius in the shade, when shade was available. The humidity was such that drying plant specimens, Bonpland's constant essential work, became genuinely difficult. Papers would absorb moisture faster than they could release it. Specimens that should have dried within days took much longer, and some were damaged before they could be properly preserved. Bonpland adapted his methods as best he could, but the conditions were working against him in almost every way, and the fact that he managed to collect and preserve as much as he did along the Orinoco is a quiet achievement that tends to get overshadowed by the more dramatic parts of the story. The journey covered approximately 2,775 kilometres by canoe, a number that is easier to say than to feel. That is the distance from London to somewhere well past Moscow, accomplished in a dugout on a river through flooded tropical forest, without reliable maps, without any certainty about what lay ahead. and with both travellers increasingly worn down by the physical demands of the trip. They were not moving quickly. The current was sometimes helpful and sometimes not. Portages were required around certain obstacles, and the stops for observation and collection added time at every stretch of the river. They passed through indigenous settlements along the way, some of them mission communities established by Spanish Franciscan and Capuchin missionaries, others more independent communities living at varying distances from colonial contact. Humboldt paid close attention to these encounters. He documented the languages he heard, the material culture he observed, the ways different communities organised their lives along the river. He was not always an entirely uncritical observer. He was a man of his time in certain respects, but he brought a genuine curiosity to the people he met, and his accounts of the indigenous communities of the Orinoco Basin remain historically significant, precisely because they were recorded with some care at a moment when many of these communities were already under significant pressure from colonial expansion. The question that had brought them this far into the interior, the question that had been sitting at the edge of European geographical knowledge for decades, was whether the Orinoco and the Amazon river systems were connected by a natural waterway somewhere in the forest between them. The idea had first been raised seriously by Charles-Marie de la Condamine, a French explorer who had travelled through the region in 1743 and come back with reports from indigenous people and local missionaries of a channel called the Cassiquiare that seemed to link the two great river systems. La Condamine had not seen it himself. He had heard about it, recorded what he heard, and the question had sat in the geographical literature since then, plausible enough to be taken seriously, unconfirmed enough to remain uncertain. Some European geographers were sceptical. The idea of a river that naturally bifurcated, sending its water into two separate drainage systems, was unusual enough to seem unlikely. Rivers, generally speaking, flow in one direction. The notion that the Orinoco could simultaneously drain toward the Atlantic through its own mouth and also send a branch southward into the Amazon basin struck some observers as the kind of thing that travellers reported when they had misunderstood local geography or been misled by their guides. Humboldt was not convinced either way before he arrived. He was there to find out. And as the canoe moved south and east through the river system, following the route that local knowledge and the missionary accounts had suggested, the Cassiquiare Canal gradually became real. They reached it in May of 1800, and what Humboldt found was not a rumour or a geographical confusion, but an actual river, a natural channel approximately 350 kilometres long, flowing southwest from the Orinoco to join the Rio Negro, which is itself a major tributary of the Amazon. It was navigable. It carried a genuine, measurable flow of water. It was exactly what La Condamine's informants had described, and it was one of the most extraordinary natural features on the continent, a natural bifurcation connecting two of the largest river systems on Earth, something that has no real parallel anywhere else in the world at this scale. Humboldt measured it carefully. He took readings of the water flow, estimated the width and depth of the channel at multiple points, fixed its position using astronomical observations, and documented it in enough detail that his account could not reasonably be questioned when it reached European scientific circles. The Cassiquiare Canal was real. The Orinoco and the Amazon were connected. A question that had been open since 1743 was now closed, and it was closed because a 29-year-old Prussian aristocrat had gotten into a dugout canoe and gone to look. There is something almost straightforwardly satisfying about that, in a world where so many questions seem to resist clean resolution. This one had an answer, and Humboldt found it. What made the discovery scientifically significant beyond simply confirming the canal's existence was the broader implication for how the river systems of the continent were understood. The Cassiquiare bifurcation meant that the interior drainage of South America was connected in ways that European maps had not reflected. It meant that species, sediments, and potentially human communities could move between the Orinoco and Amazon basins through this natural corridor. It had implications for biogeography, for understanding why certain species appeared on both sides of the divide, and for the geological history of the continent, Humboldt saw some of these implications at the time and developed others in his later writings. The measurement itself was important, but the thinking that surrounded the measurement was what gave it lasting scientific value. The return journey from the Caciquiares was hard. Both men were ill by this point, not dramatically, not in a way that makes for a sharp crisis in the telling, but in the grinding, persistent way that extended illness in difficult conditions actually works. Humboldt had symptoms consistent with a tropical fever, possibly a mild form of typhoid. Bonpland was similarly weakened. They were both thinner than when they had started, considerably more bitten, and operating on a level of physical depletion that would have sent most people to a bed and a doctor. They did not have either readily available. They turned the canoe back north and west, retracing their route through the river system toward San Fernando de Apure and eventually back toward the coast. The journey home from the Caciquiare added several more weeks of canoe travel to an expedition that had already been underway for months. They stopped where they needed to stop, collected what they could still collect, and kept moving. Humboldt's notes from this return stretch of the journey are somewhat sparser than those from the outward leg, which gives you a sense of how much the illness was affecting him. He was still observing, still recording, still making measurements, but the entries are shorter, the observations less expansive. He was running on something beyond ordinary energy by this point, some combination of discipline and genuine passion for the work that kept him functional, when a more sensible person might have simply stopped. He arrived back at the coast eventually, made his way to Cumana and then to the island of Cuba, and began the slow process of recovering his health, while also beginning to organise the enormous quantity of material the Orinoco journey had produced. The total duration of the Venezuelan and Orinoco phase of the expedition, from their arrival at Cumana in July of 1799 to their departure for Cuba in late 1800, was roughly a year and a half. In that time, Humboldt had documented the geology of the Venezuelan coast, observed and recorded the electric eels of the Llanos, crossed the vast grasslands, descended into the Orinoco basin, confirmed the existence of the Caciquiare Canal, collected thousands of plant specimens, made continuous atmospheric and astronomical measurements, and produced journals dense enough to fill several volumes on their own. He had also, in the process, developed the conceptual framework that would eventually become one of his most important contributions to science. The idea that the natural world was not a collection of separate phenomena to be catalogued individually, but an interconnected system in which climate, geology, biology, and human activity were all woven together in patterns that could be understood if you looked at them carefully enough and at large enough scale. The Orinoco had given him something beyond data. It had given him the experience of moving through a landscape that was genuinely wild in a way that Europe no longer was. A landscape where the connections between things were still visible, where the river and the forest and the insects and the plants and the indigenous communities were all clearly part of the same world, not separated by the walls and roads and agricultural fields that divided the natural from the human in Europe. He had felt, somewhere on that long canoe journey, what it was like to be inside a living system rather than observing one from a distance. That feeling, and the intellectual framework he built to describe it, would follow him for the rest of his life. Cuba, when they arrived, was a different kind of place entirely. Colonial, urban by the standards of the region, organised around the plantation economy that Humboldt would find deeply troubling. But that was the next chapter. For now, the Orinoco was behind them, the Caciquiare was confirmed and documented, and the expedition was turning in a new direction, west and south, toward the continent's spine, toward the mountains that had been waiting at the edge of Humboldt's imagination since before he ever left Europe. Cuba, in the early months of 1801, was not what Humboldt had come to the Americas to find. It was organised, it was colonial, it was legible in ways that the Orinoco basin had not been. There were roads and counting houses and sugar plantations stretching across the interior, and a port city at Havana that functioned as one of the most important commercial hubs in the Spanish colonial world. After a year and a half of canoes and jungle and river mist and insects and fever, arriving in Havana must have felt something like stepping from one century into another. Not a comfortable century necessarily, but a familiar one. Humboldt used the time in Cuba the way he used almost every pause in the expedition, not to rest in any ordinary sense, but to observe, to measure, and to write. He moved through Havana's streets and markets and institutional buildings with the same systematic attention he had brought to the Llanos and the Orinoco. He visited plantations, he spoke with merchants and colonial officials, he gathered economic data, figures on sugar production, on trade volumes, on the demographics of the island's population. And what he found there troubled him in a way that the natural world, however dangerous, never quite did. Cuba in 1801 was built on slavery. This was not a secret or a surprise. It was the open organising principle of the island's economy, and everyone who moved through Havana's commercial world understood it as such. What was unusual was Humboldt's response to it. He was not the first European traveller to observe slavery in the Americas and feel discomfort. But he went considerably further than discomfort. In his writings about Cuba, which he developed over the following years and eventually published in a volume called The Political Essay on the Island of Cuba in 1826, he condemned the institution in terms that were explicit and unambiguous for the era. He wrote about the violence that sustained it, about the systematic dehumanization it required, about the way it corrupted not just the enslaved, but the entire social and moral fabric of the societies that depended on it. He called it a degradation of human dignity. He used the word abolition. These were not safe positions for a man who depended on the goodwill of Spanish colonial authorities for his travel permissions and his access to scientific resources, and the fact that he expressed them anyway says something about what kind of person he actually was underneath the careful scientific apparatus. His condemnation of slavery would become one of the more striking aspects of his Cuban writings, and it would eventually cause a peculiar problem. When the Political Essay on the Island of Cuba was published in an English translation in the United States in 1856, the American publisher quietly removed the anti-slavery sections. The reasoning was commercial, the book had an audience in the American South, and the publisher did not want to offend that audience. Humboldt, still alive at the time and still sharp at 86 years old, was furious when he found out and publicly demanded that the excise sections be restored. It is a small story, but it tells you something about both the man and the world he was navigating. The original plan, when Humboldt and Bonpland arrived in Cuba, had been to use the island as a staging point before joining the French expedition, led by Nicolas Baudin, which was making its way around the globe and was expected to touch the western coast of South America. Humboldt had been loosely attached to this expedition in spirit, if not in formal arrangement. The idea had been that he and Bonpland might rendezvous with Baudin somewhere along the Pacific coast and continue their work under that umbrella. It was a reasonable plan. It gave the second phase of the expedition a kind of institutional anchor. But the plan fell apart, and it fell apart for the simplest possible reason. Humboldt could not get reliable information about where Baudin actually was. The expedition had left France, but its schedule was fluid and its route uncertain, and communications across the Atlantic in 1801 were slow enough that by the time any news arrived, it was already old. Humboldt waited in Cuba for word that did not come in a form he could act on, and eventually he made a decision. He would not wait any longer. He would go south on his own terms into the South American mainland and find his way to the Andes by whatever route presented itself. It was, in retrospect, exactly the right decision, because the Andes were where the most important work of the entire expedition would happen. But it was not obvious at the time. It was just a man deciding that waiting was costing him more than moving. They left Cuba and sailed to Cartagena de Indias, on the northern coast of what is now Colombia. Cartagena was a walled colonial city, one of the great ports of the Spanish-American Empire, and Humboldt paused there long enough to take measurements and make observations before turning inland. The route south toward Bogotá required crossing the Magdalena River Valley, and this was where the journey became genuinely difficult in a different way than the Orinoco had been. The Orinoco had been difficult in the way of the wild. Insects, illness, isolation, the sheer indifference of a landscape that did not care about human beings at all. The Magdalena Valley was difficult in the way of hard terrain combined with heat and the logistical complications of moving through a landscape that was partly settled and partly not, where roads existed in theory but in practice were often more suggestion than infrastructure. The journey up the Magdalena River took weeks. They travelled partly by boat and partly on foot and partly on the backs of animals, climbing gradually as the river narrowed and the terrain became more demanding. The heat in the lower valley was intense. Humboldt recorded temperatures that would have been familiar to anyone who'd spent time in the Llanos. But the humidity was different here, thicker and more persistent. He kept taking measurements through all of it, of course. Air temperature, barometric pressure, the composition of the rock formations along the riverbanks, the distribution of plant species as the elevation slowly changed. Even on a difficult transit through difficult terrain, the scientific work continued. This was simply how Humboldt moved through the world. As they climbed higher, the heat gave way to something cooler, and the landscape shifted around them. The vegetation changed, the dense tropical growth of the lower valley thinning and transforming as they gained altitude. The species compositions shifting in ways that Humboldt was already beginning to recognize as systematic rather than random. He had seen something similar in Venezuela, and he would see it again and again in the Andes ahead. The idea was forming in him that elevation was a kind of compressed geography, that climbing a mountain was in some ways like travelling from the equator toward the poles, passing through analogous climatic zones stacked one above another. He was not yet ready to formalize this idea, but it was accumulating in his notebooks alongside everything else. Bogotá, known then as Santa Fe de Bogotá, sitting at about 2,600 meters above sea level on the eastern flank of the Andes, was where Humboldt had arranged to meet José Celestino Mutis. This meeting deserves to be described with some care because it was genuinely significant, and because Mutis himself is not as well known as he should be. Mutis was 68 years old when Humboldt arrived in Bogotá in the summer of 1801. He had come to New Granada, the colonial territory that is now Colombia, as a young physician in 1760, and he had spent the 4 decades since then doing something remarkable, conducting a systematic botanical survey of the region's plant life, a project he called the Flora de Bogotá. He had trained local artists to produce botanical illustrations of extraordinary quality, hundreds of them, depicting plant species that European science had never formally described. He had built up an herbarium and a library in Bogotá that were, in their way, among the most important scientific resources in the Americas. He had done all of this largely in isolation, far from the centres of European scientific life, sustained by his own curiosity and the patronage of the colonial government and the church. When Humboldt arrived, Mutis gave him access to everything. The herbarium, the illustrations, the library, the accumulated knowledge of 40 years of careful observation in a part of the world that European naturalists had barely touched. Humboldt later described the meeting as one of the most moving of the entire expedition, and you can understand why. Here were 2 men who had each, in their different ways, devoted themselves to understanding the natural world of the Americas, one through a lifetime of patient residence, the other through a few years of intense travel, and they recognized in each other something essential. Humboldt was 31, Mutis was 68. The difference in their ages and circumstances made the meeting feel, Humboldt wrote, like a kind of inheritance being passed. They spent several weeks in Bogotá. Humboldt worked through Mutis's collections, took measurements, made notes, and had long conversations with the older man about Colombian botany, geology, and the natural history of the Andes. Mutis gave him specimens and drawings to take with him, contributions to the eventual publications that Humboldt was already beginning to plan in his mind. When Humboldt finally left Bogotá and turned south, he was carrying not just his own months of accumulated observation, but some part of Mutis's 40 years as well. The route south from Bogotá followed the Andes, which is to say it followed the mountains themselves, climbing and descending through passes, crossing rivers swollen with Andean snowmelt, moving through landscapes that shifted with the altitude in those patterns Humboldt was increasingly attentive to. The road, such as it was, connected the major colonial settlements of the Andean interior, Popayan, then Pasto, then the long descent toward Quito in what is now Ecuador. The journey took months. The terrain was beautiful and demanding in roughly equal measure. Humboldt's notebooks from this stretch of the journey are full of the detail that characterized everything he did. He was measuring and observing constantly the temperature of the air at different elevations, the species of plants growing at different altitudes, the appearance and composition of the rock formations, the behavior of the rivers, the customs and languages of the indigenous communities through whose territories the road passed. He was also, increasingly, thinking about volcanoes. The Andes in this region are one of the most volcanically active zones on Earth, and as he moved south he began to encounter them, not as distant dramatic features of the landscape, but as objects of serious scientific interest that he could approach, measure, and in some cases climb. He had already been thinking about volcanoes since Tenerife, where he and Bonpland had climbed the Teide before the Atlantic crossing. The Andes gave him something vastly more complex to work with. The volcanoes here were bigger, more numerous, and more varied in their character, some actively smoking, some dormant, some showing signs of recent eruption in the form of fresh lava fields and ash deposits. Humboldt began to develop ideas about the relationship between volcanic activity and the underlying structure of the Earth, about the way volcanoes might be connected to each other through deep geological processes rather than being isolated phenomena. This was not standard thinking in 1801. The science of geology was still young enough that many of its most basic questions were unresolved, and Humboldt's ideas about volcanic systems were ahead of where the mainstream of European geological thinking had arrived. By the time he reached Quito, which would serve as his base for the most intense phase of the Andean work, he had already accumulated more observations about the Andes than any previous European scientist. But Quito was not a destination in itself. It was a staging point. From Quito, the mountains that had haunted his imagination since Paris, the great volcanoes of the Ecuadorian Andes, and above all the one he had read about and dreamed about and oriented his entire journey toward, were finally within reach. Chimborazo was still out there, to the south, still waiting, still the highest point on Earth as far as anyone in the scientific world knew. And Humboldt, standing in Quito with his instruments and his notebooks and the accumulated momentum of 3 years of travel, was closer to it now than he had ever been. The approach to that mountain and everything that happened on it was still ahead, but it was no longer distant. It was the next thing, so he moved south from Quito, and the mountains moved with him. That is not quite a metaphor. The Andes and Ecuador are arranged in two parallel chains running roughly north to south, with a high valley between them that the geographer and explorer Wilhelm Reis would later call the Avenue of the Volcanoes. Humboldt, travelling through it in 1801 and into 1802, was surrounded on both sides by enormous volcanic peaks, some snow-capped and silent, some visibly active, all of them enormous in a way that is hard to fully convey if you have only encountered mountains in photographs. They were not just tall, they were present in a way that dominated the entire landscape, the weather, the character of the light at different times of day, the temperature of the air, the kinds of plants that grew at different distances from their flanks. Humboldt had been in mountains before, the Harz in Germany, the Pyrenees, Tenerife. None of them had prepared him for this. He approached the volcanoes the way he approached everything, systematically with instruments, and with what you might describe as a kind of patient urgency. He was not simply admiring them, he was trying to understand them as components of a larger system, which meant getting as close to them as he possibly could, measuring whatever could be measured, and recording what he observed with the same care he had applied to the electric eels in the Llanos, and the water temperature of the Cassiquiare and the botanical collections of Bogota. The volcanoes were just another set of phenomena to be read, even if they were phenomena on a scale that occasionally made reading them quite dangerous. Pichincha was one of the first. It sits just west of Quito, close enough that its eruptions have historically buried parts of the city in ash. Humboldt climbed to its crater rim, which sits at roughly 4,700 metres, and looked down into the active vent below. He recorded what he saw: the sulphurous gases, the temperature of the rocks near the vent, the appearance of the crater walls, and he took barometric pressure readings and air temperature measurements at that altitude. He was not the first person to climb Pichincha, but he was almost certainly the first to climb it with the specific intention of treating it as a scientific instrument, a window into the behaviour of the Earth's interior. The climb was not comfortable. Pichincha's upper slopes are loose and unstable in places, and the altitude alone is enough to make ordinary movement feel effortful. Humboldt noted the symptoms carefully: the headache, the nausea, the peculiar shortness of breath that came not from exertion alone but from something in the air itself. He did not yet have the full physiological explanation for what he was experiencing. The understanding of oxygen partial pressure at altitude was still developing in European science. But he was observant enough to document the symptoms in detail and to begin connecting them to the altitude rather than to individual constitutional illness. This condition, which Andean communities had long recognized and called soroche, was something Humboldt encountered again and again in the months that followed, and his careful documentation of it would contribute to later scientific understanding of how the human body responds to reduced atmospheric pressure. Antisana came next, or near enough. It is a massive stratovolcano southeast of Quito, its summit at 5,753 metres, and Humboldt and his companions climbed high on its slopes in the early months of 1802. The conditions at that altitude were genuinely harsh, not the dramatic sudden harshness of a storm, but the slow grinding difficulty of cold and thin air and terrain that demanded constant physical effort. Humboldt's hands were numb much of the time. His lips were cracked from the cold and the dryness of the air at altitude. He was taking readings throughout, stopping to set up his instruments on whatever relatively stable surface presented itself, noting the barometric pressure, the temperature, the direction and strength of the wind, the character of the rock formations underfoot. He was also looking at the plants. This is where something important began to crystallize in his thinking, something he had been noticing for months, but that became unmistakably clear on the slopes of Antisana and the other great Andean peaks. The vegetation did not simply thin out as the altitude increased. It changed in an organized, predictable way. There were distinct bands, zones where certain species grew and others did not, boundaries that were not sharp lines but gradual transitions, and those transitions followed the temperature and moisture conditions at each elevation with a consistency that could not be coincidental. At the lower elevations, the tropical forest species. Higher up, a different community of plants adapted to cooler, cloudier conditions. Higher still, the high-altitude grasslands called paramo, with their own distinctive flora, the giant frailejones, those strange, sculptural plants that look like something from a different planet, covered in soft silver leaves and rising on thick stems from the boggy ground. And above the paramo, eventually bare rock and ice and the limits of plant life altogether. Humboldt had seen something like this pattern before, on Tenerife, where the vegetation on the slopes of Teide changed with altitude in a way that he had noted with interest. But the Andes gave him the pattern on a vast scale, repeated across volcano after volcano, consistent enough to be unmistakable. What he was observing was not just a curiosity about individual mountains, it was a principle. The distribution of plant communities across the surface of the Earth was not random. It followed environmental conditions, primarily temperature and moisture, and altitude was simply one of the most dramatic ways those conditions varied over short distances. The same logic that explained why different plants grew at different elevations in the Andes could explain why different plants grew at different latitudes across the globe. The tropical forests of the lowlands corresponded in some deep structural sense to the vegetation of warm lowland regions everywhere. The cold, sparse plants of the high Andean peaks corresponded to the vegetation of the Arctic. This was the seed of what would become biogeography, the scientific study of how living things are distributed across the Earth and why. The idea that species distribution follows environmental patterns rather than being simply the result of each species being created for its particular location was not entirely new, but Humboldt gave it an empirical foundation and a systematic framework that it had not previously had. He was not just observing that different places had different plants. He was beginning to map the underlying logic of those differences to show that the natural world was organized according to principles that could be discovered and described. The diagram that would eventually express this most powerfully, the one he called the Naturgemälde, which translates roughly as nature picture or nature painting, was taking shape in his mind as he climbed. He had begun sketching it out during his time in Quito, and it would eventually become one of the most influential scientific illustrations ever made. It depicted a cross-section of Chimborazo from its base to its summit, with the vegetation zones labelled at their appropriate elevations on the mountain's flanks. Around the mountain, in columns running alongside the illustration, were corresponding data for other variables: the temperature of the air, the barometric pressure, the humidity, the blueness of the sky, the boiling point of water, the species of animals present at each elevation. The whole thing was a portrait of interconnection, a visual argument that altitude, temperature, plant life, animal life, atmospheric conditions, and a dozen other variables were not separate phenomena but aspects of a single integrated system. He was also increasingly thinking about volcanoes not as isolated features, but as part of a global pattern. He had read everything available about volcanic activity before leaving Europe, and his months in the Andes were giving him an empirical basis for ideas that were genuinely ahead of their time. He suspected that volcanoes were connected to each other through deep processes in the Earth's interior, that their distribution on the surface of the planet was not random, and that their activity was related to the larger dynamics of the planet itself. He was not in a position to prove any of this with the tools available to him. The full understanding of plate tectonics was more than a century away, but the direction of his thinking was sound, and his observations of multiple volcanoes across a wide geographic area gave him a comparative perspective that no previous scientist had had. Cotopaxi deserves a mention here, because Humboldt spent time near it and was deeply impressed by it. Cotopaxi is one of the highest active volcanoes in the world, its summit at 5,897 metres, and it is also one of the most symmetrically beautiful, a near-perfect cone of snow and ice rising above the Paramo. Humboldt observed it carefully and documented its form, its activity, its relationship to the surrounding landscape. He recorded the sounds it made, the low rumbling that residents of the surrounding area had learned to interpret as a sign of its mood, and he noted the way its ash deposits had affected the soil and vegetation of the region. He was treating it, as he treated everything, as a piece of evidence in a larger argument about the way the Earth worked. The physical toll of all this was real and cumulative. By early 1802, after months of high-altitude travel, repeated climbs, inadequate food, cold nights, and the constant low-grade difficulty of operating at elevations where the body simply works harder than it was designed to, both Humboldt and Bonpland were showing the wear. Humboldt's descriptions of his own physical state during this period are matter of fact rather than dramatic. He notes the headaches, the fatigue, the way certain tasks that would be simple at sea level became effortful at 4,000 metres. He does not complain exactly, but you can read between the lines of his journals and understand that this was not comfortable. He was pushing himself and everyone around him at a pace that the terrain and the altitude made genuinely punishing, and yet the work continued. The notebooks filled. The plant specimens were pressed and labelled. The barometric readings were taken and recorded. The rock samples were collected and described. The conversations with indigenous guides and local residents were noted down, along with observations about their languages, their agricultural practices, their knowledge of the local plants and animals, knowledge that Humboldt respected and tried to record with some care, even if his framework for understanding it was inevitably shaped by the European scientific tradition he came from. He was not a perfect observer by modern standards, and some of his assumptions about the indigenous peoples he encountered reflect the limitations of his era. But he was more attentive and more respectful than most European travellers of his time, and his records of Andean indigenous life and knowledge have genuine historical value. Carlos Montúfar joined the expedition in Quito. He was the son of the Marquis of Selva Alegre, a prominent local figure, and he would remain with Humboldt for much of the remainder of the journey, including the climb that was still ahead. His presence added a local dimension to the expedition's social composition that it had not had before, someone who knew the terrain, the people, and the conditions of the Ecuadorian Andes from the inside rather than as a foreign visitor. Humboldt valued this, and the two men developed a genuine friendship over the months that followed. By June of 1802, the preparations for the attempt on Chimborazo were coming together. The mountain had been visible from various points along the route for weeks, its enormous bulk rising above the surrounding peaks to the south of Quito. On clear days, the summit, a broad, irregular mass of snow and ice, was visible from distances of more than 100 kilometres. Humboldt had been looking at it for months. He had been reading about it for years since his days in Paris when he had first encountered descriptions of it, and fixed it in his mind as the highest point on Earth, the summit of the world as far as European science knew. Everything that had happened since then, the Orinoco, Cuba, Bogota, the months in the Andes, had been in some sense the long approach to this moment. The mountain was not just a physical goal, it was an intellectual one. Humboldt wanted to take measurements at the highest altitude any human being had ever reached. Barometric pressure, temperature, the composition of the air, the colour of the sky, the behaviour of his instruments in conditions that no one had yet tested them in. He wanted data from the roof of the world, and he wanted to see from that height whether the pattern of interconnection he'd been mapping across the Andes would resolve itself into something even clearer when viewed from above. He was 32 years old. He had been travelling for nearly 3 years. He was thinner than he had been in Berlin, and tougher, and carrying in his notebooks and his memory a volume of observation about the natural world of South America that no European had ever accumulated. And Chimborazo was still out there, patient and enormous, waiting in the cold southern air of the Ecuadorian highlands. What happened on that mountain, the climb itself, the conditions, how far they reached, and what Humboldt saw and felt and measured at the highest point any human being had ever stood, that is the next part of the story. The morning of June 23rd, 1802 arrived cold and clear over the Ecuadorian highlands. Chimborazo stood to the southwest, as it always did, its upper slopes lit pale orange by the early sun, its summit disappearing into a thin band of cloud that had settled around the mountain's shoulders during the night. The air at the base camp was already thin enough to feel a particular kind of quiet that altitude imposes on the body, a slight heaviness in the chest, a reminder that the atmosphere here is doing less work than usual on your behalf. Humboldt, Bonpland, Carlos Montúfar, and an indigenous guide whose name does not appear consistently in the historical record set out early. They were dressed in what they had: wool coats, leather boots, the kind of practical layered clothing that travellers in the Andes wore at the time. There were no ropes, there was no technical climbing equipment in any meaningful sense. The tools they carried were scientific instruments: a barometer, a thermometer, a cyanometer for measuring the blueness of the sky, a compass, a hypsometer for estimating altitude by the boiling point of water. Humboldt also carried a notebook, as he always did. The party moved upward on foot across the lower flanks of the mountain, which were covered in a coarse yellowish grass called ichu that gave way gradually to bare rock, and then, higher still, to patches of ice and compacted snow. Chimborazo is not a technically extreme mountain in the way that some of the great Himalayan peaks are. It does not require the specialised techniques of modern alpinism, but at over 6,200 metres, it is enormous, and in 1802, with no acclimatization protocols, no supplemental oxygen, no modern understanding of how altitude affects the human body, and no experience of high-altitude mountaineering as a practice, because that practice barely existed yet. It was as serious an undertaking as anything a person could attempt. The mountain had been climbed to lower elevations before by indigenous Andean people who had reasons of their own to be on its slopes, but no European expedition had made a documented attempt to reach anything close to the summit. The early part of the climb went well enough. Humboldt was experienced in altitude by this point. He had spent months at elevations above 3,000 meters, had climbed Pichincha and Antisana, had crossed passes in the Andes that would have left most Europeans gasping. His body had adapted, at least partially, to the demands of high elevation. But Chimborazo was different. The slopes steepened as they gained height, and the terrain became increasingly difficult. Loose rock over ice, sections where the footing was uncertain, places where a misstep would have been genuinely dangerous. There were no fixed ropes, no safety systems of any kind. Each step was simply a step placed carefully and committed to. By mid-morning the altitude sickness had set in properly. Humboldt describes it in his journals with his characteristic combination of precision and restraint. The headache that settled behind the eyes and temples, the nausea that came in waves, the strange sensation of the skin on his hands and face beginning to bleed. This last detail is one that stops you when you read it. At extreme altitude, the reduced atmospheric pressure causes small blood vessels near the surface of the skin to rupture. Humboldt and Bonpland both experienced bleeding from their gums, their lips, and the edges of their fingernails. It was not dramatic in the way a wound is dramatic. It was quiet and persistent, a physical reminder that the body was operating outside its designed range. The guide turned back at some point in the upper reaches, which is not recorded as a failure or a criticism in Humboldt's account. It was simply a practical decision, the kind that people who know mountains make when they read the conditions correctly. The three Europeans continued. Bonpland was struggling. Montufar was struggling. Humboldt was struggling. All of them were moving slowly, stopping frequently, taking the kind of deliberate, effortful steps that high altitude imposes on the body regardless of fitness or determination. The cloud that had been sitting around the mountain's upper shoulders in the morning had not fully cleared, and visibility came and went. They reached approximately 5,878 meters, 19,286 feet, before they were stopped. Not by exhaustion alone, though exhaustion was certainly present. They were stopped by a ravine, a gap in the ridge, perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide, filled with loose snow and dropping steeply on both sides, cutting across their route to the higher slopes above. Without ropes, without the equipment to cross it safely, it was simply impassable. Humboldt looked at it, assessed it, and understood that this was where the climb ended. He was roughly 385 meters below the true summit, which rises to 6,263 meters. He would not reach it. No one in the party would. What he did instead, standing at the edge of that ravine in the cold, thin air at nearly 5,900 meters, was take measurements. This is perhaps the most Humboldt thing imaginable. Stopped at the highest point any human being had ever stood, bleeding slightly from the gums, dizzy with altitude, surrounded by cloud and ice, and he took out his instruments and got to work. The barometric pressure reading at that altitude was 13.3 inches of mercury, compared to roughly 30 inches at sea level. The temperature was minus 1.3 degrees Celsius. He used his cyanometer, a small circular device with a graduated scale of blue tones, to measure the colour of the sky above him, which at that altitude and in those conditions was a deep, saturated blue that he noted was several degrees darker than anything he had measured at lower elevations. He recorded the boiling point of water to estimate the altitude. He observed the physical symptoms he and his companions were experiencing and noted them carefully. Then he looked out. The view from that height, on a partially clear day, over the Ecuadorian Andes, would have been extraordinary. The surrounding peaks, Cotopaxi, Antisana, the ranges that stretched in every direction, were below him or at his level, or only slightly above. The landscape he'd been travelling through for months, the valleys and rivers and volcanic cones and high Paramo grasslands, was spread out beneath him in a way that no map could fully represent. He could see the curvature of the terrain, the way the land fell away in every direction, the relationship between features that had seemed separate and distinct when viewed from within them but now resolved into a coherent geography. Humboldt wrote about this moment in his later work, and what he described was not simply the physical view. He described a feeling, a sense of standing at a vantage point from which the connections he had been tracing across months of travel suddenly became visible in a different way. The vegetation zones he had mapped as they climbed, the ichu grass giving way to bare rock, the rock giving way to ice, were a physical expression of the same principle he had observed in the changing forests of the Orinoco lowlands and the cloud forests of the Andean slopes. Altitude did what latitude did. The mountain was a compressed version of the journey from the equator to the poles, written vertically in plant communities and temperature gradients and atmospheric conditions. Standing at 5,878 meters, he was standing at the top of a living diagram of the principle he had been trying to articulate since before he left Europe. This is where the Naturgemälde, the nature picture, became something more than a concept. Humboldt had been developing the idea for years, but the climb of Chimborazo seems to have crystallized it. The Naturgemälde was a diagram he would eventually publish, showing a cross-section of Chimborazo from base to summit, with the different zones of vegetation mapped at their corresponding altitudes, alongside columns of data, temperature, barometric pressure, humidity, sky colour, the distribution of animal life, the altitude at which certain plant families disappeared. It was not a conventional scientific chart. It was something closer to a portrait of the mountain as a system, showing all of its components at once and the relationships between them. It was arguably one of the most important scientific images ever produced, not because of any single fact it contained, but because of the way it presented nature as a connected whole rather than a collection of separate observations. The descent from Chimborazo was long and difficult. The altitude sickness did not ease until they had lost significant elevation, and the physical toll of the climb, the cold, the bleeding, the effort, settled into the body in the particular way that extreme exertion does, as a heavy, bone-deep tiredness that is different from ordinary fatigue. Humboldt does not spend much time describing the descent in his writings. He was already thinking forward, already processing what he had measured and seen, already working through the implications of the data in his notebooks. That was simply how his mind operated. The experience was not over when the physical event ended. It continued in the analysis, the writing, the slow construction of meaning from raw observation. It is worth pausing for a moment to appreciate what had actually happened on June 23rd, 1802, because it is easy to read past it. Humboldt and his companions had reached a higher elevation than any human being had ever been documented to reach. Not a few meters higher, significantly higher. The previous record, set by a French expedition that had climbed Mont Blanc in 1787, was around 4,807 meters. Humboldt had exceeded that by more than 1,000 meters. He had done it without any of the equipment that later generations would consider essential for high-altitude mountaineering, and he had done it while conducting scientific measurements along the way. The altitude record he set on Chimborazo would stand for nearly 30 years, until the first Himalayan expeditions began pushing into territory that Chimborazo, for all its height, could not match. And Chimborazo itself, it is worth saying something about the mountain's actual place in the world, because Humboldt's understanding of it reflects the state of geographical knowledge in 1802. He believed, as everyone did at the time, that Chimborazo was the highest mountain on Earth. It was the peak that appeared tallest on available maps, and no systematic survey of the Himalayas had yet been conducted by European science. The Himalayas were known to exist, but their heights had not been measured with any precision. So when Humboldt climbed Chimborazo, he was, in his own understanding and in the understanding of everyone who would read his account, attempting the summit of the world's highest mountain. The fact that Chimborazo is not the highest mountain on Earth, Everest, at 8,849 metres, is nearly 2,600 metres taller, does not diminish what he did. It simply locates it correctly in its historical moment. There is one more thing about Chimborazo that is genuinely interesting, and that Humboldt could not have known in 1802. Due to the equatorial bulge of the Earth, the fact that the planet is slightly wider at the equator than at the poles, Chimborazo's summit is actually the farthest point from the centre of the Earth of any mountain on the planet. Everest is higher above sea level, but Chimborazo's position near the equator means that its peak extends further into space than any other point on the Earth's surface. In a sense that Humboldt would have appreciated deeply, the mountain he climbed was, in fact, the highest point on Earth, just not measured in the way he thought. The universe, it seems, was being quietly generous with him. Carlos Montúfar continued with the expedition after Chimborazo. He was a willing and capable companion, and Humboldt clearly valued his presence and his knowledge of the region. Their friendship would last beyond the expedition itself. Montúfar eventually travelled to Europe, spent time in Humboldt's circle in Paris, and later returned to South America, where he became involved in the independence movements that were beginning to stir in the early 19th century. His story after the expedition is its own complicated and ultimately tragic chapter, but in the summer of 1802, he was simply a young man from Quito who had climbed the highest mountain in the world with a Prussian scientist and come back down with cold hands and a story worth telling. The expedition moved on. There were still thousands of kilometres to cover, still measurements to take, still observations to record. The Andes continued to the south, and the route ahead would take the party through Peru, down to the Pacific coast to Lima and Callao, and the cold waters of the ocean that ran northward along the South American shore. The notebooks were filling. The plant specimens were accumulating. The barometric readings and temperature measurements and magnetic intensity observations were building into a data set that had no precedent in the history of science. Chimborazo was behind them now, growing smaller in the rear view of the journey, though it would never entirely leave Humboldt's thinking. He would return to it again and again in his writing, use it as the organising image of the Naturgemälde, cite it in lectures and letters and published works for the rest of his life. But the journey was not finished, and Humboldt was not the kind of person who lingered at summits, literal or otherwise. The Pacific was ahead, and with it, a cold current running against the warm surrounding sea, and a set of observations about the ocean and the coast that would eventually carry his name further than almost anything else he ever did. The descent from the Andes into Peru was long and gradual, and the landscape changed in ways that Humboldt documented with the same careful attention he had given to everything else. The high cold plateau gave way to lower valleys, and the air thickened slowly, and the vegetation shifted from the sparse grasses and cushion plants of the Puna into denser, greener territory. By the time the expedition reached the coast, the world looked and felt entirely different from anything they had moved through in the mountains. The Pacific coast of South America has a particular quality to it that is unlike most tropical coastlines. It is dry. In many places, extraordinarily dry. Some stretches of the Peruvian coast receive almost no rainfall at all across entire years, which seems improbable given how close they sit to the equator. The reason for this, as Humboldt was about to discover, had everything to do with the water. He arrived in Lima in late 1802 and made his way to the port of Callao, which sits just a few kilometres west of the city, on a small peninsula reaching into the Pacific. Callao was the main Pacific port of Spanish South America, a busy and commercially important place, and Humboldt had scientific business there beyond simply passing through. He was tracking the transit of Mercury across the face of the Sun, which occurred on November 9th, 1802, and Callao offered a clear enough horizon and sufficient equipment for the observation. He recorded it carefully. But what occupied his attention more persistently, and what would ultimately prove more consequential for his scientific legacy, was the temperature of the water itself. Humboldt began taking measurements of the ocean surface temperature along the Peruvian coast, and what he found was striking. The water running northward along the coast was significantly colder than the surrounding ocean. Not slightly cooler, measurably, substantially colder. He recorded temperatures of around 16 degrees Celsius in the coastal current, while the open Pacific nearby registered close to 26 degrees. That is a 10-degree difference, which in ocean terms is enormous. He measured it repeatedly at different points along the coast, checking and cross-checking, because that is what he did with everything. He did not trust a single reading when multiple readings were possible. The cold current running up the western coast of South America had been known to local fishermen and navigators for a very long time. Indigenous peoples along the coast had understood its effects on their fishing and their weather for centuries before any European arrived. But Humboldt was the first person to measure it systematically, to record its temperatures with precision, to document its extent and its behaviour, and to begin thinking about what it meant for the climate and ecology of the entire region. The current would eventually be named after him, the Humboldt Current, though Humboldt himself never called it that, and the naming came later through the work of cartographers and oceanographers who recognised that his measurements were the first rigorous scientific documentation of the phenomenon. What makes the Humboldt Current interesting, beyond the simple fact of its coldness, is what it does to the world around it. Cold water rising from the deep ocean along the Peruvian coast brings nutrients to the surface in enormous quantities, a process called upwelling, and those nutrients feed some of the most productive marine ecosystems on the planet. The fish populations along this coast are extraordinary. Anchovies in particular gather in vast schools in the cold, nutrient-rich water, and those anchovies support seabirds in numbers that have to be seen, or at least read about carefully to be believed. Humboldt saw the birds. He saw them in their millions, blackening the sky above certain coastal islands, and he understood, with the instinct that characterized his best scientific thinking, that the birds and the fish and the cold water and the nutrients were all part of the same system. The birds produced guano, enormous quantities of guano, accumulated over centuries on the islands off the Peruvian coast, particularly the Chincha Islands, which sit roughly 200 kilometers south of Lima. Humboldt visited these islands and observed the guano deposits with careful attention. The deposits were deep, in some places many meters deep, built up over generations of seabird nesting. The Inca civilization had understood the agricultural value of this guano for centuries and had managed its collection carefully. Humboldt recognized immediately what he was looking at. He analyzed samples, documented the nitrogen content, and wrote about the extraordinary fertilizing potential of the material with a clarity and conviction that was, at the time, well ahead of European agricultural understanding. He predicted, essentially, that guano would prove to be one of the most valuable agricultural resources in the world. He was right. In the 1840s, about 4 decades after Humboldt's visit, guano became one of the most sought-after commodities in global trade. Ships came from Europe and North America to load it by the hundreds of thousands of tons. Peru's economy was transformed for a time by the guano trade, and the nitrogen-rich deposits from the Chincha Islands helped feed crops across Britain, France, and the eastern United States. The economic boom was enormous and eventually catastrophic in the way that resource booms often are. But the underlying science that Humboldt had identified on those islands in 1802 was entirely correct. He had looked at a pile of bird droppings and understood its place in a global system of ecology and agriculture. That kind of thinking was not common in 1802. The dryness of the coast also interested him. He understood that the cold current was responsible for it. Cold water cools the air above it, which reduces the moisture the air can carry, which suppresses rainfall. The Atacama Desert, which begins in northern Chile and extends through southern Peru, is one of the driest places on Earth, partly because of this mechanism. Humboldt was working out the relationship between ocean temperature and coastal climate in a way that would eventually become foundational to climatology, though the word itself barely existed yet. He was doing what he always did, connecting observations across different domains, refusing to treat the temperature of the water as a separate fact from the dryness of the air, or the abundance of the fish, or the depth of the guano. From the coast, he travelled inland to Cajamarca, in the northern highlands of Peru. Cajamarca is a place with a very specific and heavy history. It was at Cajamarca in 1532 that Francisco Pizarro captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, in what is one of the most consequential and brutal moments of the entire Spanish conquest of the Americas. Atahualpa had come to meet the Spanish with thousands of his people, and Pizarro's much smaller force ambushed them, killed a vast number of unarmed attendants, and took the emperor prisoner. Atahualpa offered an extraordinary ransom, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver, and the Spanish accepted it and then executed him anyway. The room where he was held, the ransom room, was still standing when Humboldt visited, and he walked through it and wrote about what he saw with the kind of measured historical weight that the place demanded. His reflections on Cajamarca were not purely archaeological. He was thinking about the conquest in political and moral terms, about what the Spanish Empire had done to the civilizations it encountered, about the long-term consequences of that violence for the people who lived in South America in his own time. He had been making these observations throughout the journey, in Venezuela, in Colombia, in Peru, and they were building toward a critique of colonial exploitation that was unusually direct for a European traveller of his era and background. Humboldt was a guest of the Spanish Empire, travelling on a royal passport, and yet he wrote with considerable frankness about the damage that empire had done and continued to do. He documented forced indigenous labour, the tax structures that extracted wealth from local populations, the social hierarchies that kept colonial subjects in conditions of poverty and legal disadvantage. He did not dress these observations in diplomatic softness. He called what he saw what it was. This was not entirely without risk. He was careful in how he published these views, and the political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, which drew heavily on his observations from this period, was written with enough analytical distance to function as scholarship rather than polemic. But the underlying moral position was not ambiguous. Humboldt believed that the colonial system was unjust, that it was economically irrational as well as morally wrong, and that the people of South America would be better served by independence and self-governance than by continued extraction in the service of European powers. These were views that would prove historically significant. Simón Bolívar, who would lead the independence movements of northern South America in the following decades, knew Humboldt's work well and drew on his analysis of colonial economics. But that part of the story comes later. In Peru, in 1802, Humboldt was still gathering, still measuring, still writing, still filling notebooks with observations that range from the specific temperature of a coastal current to the depth of a guano deposit, to the dimensions of an Inca ruin, to the wages paid to indigenous miners in highland silver operations. The range of his attention was genuinely staggering. On a single day, he might record barometric pressure at dawn, collect plant specimens in the morning, interview a local official about tax collection in the afternoon, take ocean temperature readings at the harbour in the evening, and write up observations on the local geology before sleeping. This was not occasional multitasking. It was the sustained daily practice of a mind that understood everything as connected and therefore found everything worth examining. His health was not always cooperating. The expedition had been physically punishing from the beginning. The canoe journey through the Orinoco, the Andes crossings at altitude, the Chimborazo climb, and by the time he reached the Peruvian coast, both he and Bonpland were carrying the accumulated physical cost of more than 3 years of hard travel. Bonpland in particular had been seriously ill more than once. Humboldt seems to have had a remarkable physical constitution, or perhaps simply a remarkable capacity for ignoring physical difficulty, because he continued working at a pace that would have been impressive for someone half his age sitting comfortably in a European study, let alone someone recovering from altitude sickness in a coastal port. The plant specimens Bonpland had collected were a logistical challenge in themselves. They had to be dried, pressed, labelled, packed, and protected from moisture and insects. A constant and painstaking process. Some specimens had been shipped ahead to Europe from various points along the journey, but many were still travelling with the expedition, and their preservation required daily attention. Bonpland managed this with quiet competence. He was not the public face of the expedition. Humboldt's name is the one history remembered. But the botanical collection that eventually made it back to Europe, thousands of specimens representing plants that had never been described by European science, was Bonpland's achievement as much as Humboldt's. The two men worked together with a compatibility that seems, from the written record, to have been genuine and relatively uncomplicated, which is its own small miracle given the conditions they were operating under. From Lima and Callao, the expedition began making its way back northward along the coast toward Guayaquil, in what is now Ecuador. The Pacific stretched westward in its cold, grey-green immensity, and the coastal current ran alongside them, that same cold stream that Humboldt had measured and documented and thought about for weeks. He was already beginning to understand it not just as a local oceanographic feature, but as a component of a much larger planetary system. The way ocean temperatures shaped wind patterns, which shaped rainfall, which shaped vegetation, which shaped what kinds of animals and human civilizations could exist in a given place. The current was not just cold water. It was a thread in a web that connected the deep ocean floor to the sky above Lima, to the guano on the Chincha Islands, to the crops grown in European fields. That is how Humboldt's mind worked. And it is, as it happens, how the world actually works, which is why his thinking proved so durable. The route north would eventually lead out of South America entirely, toward New Spain and the long passage that would bring the expedition, after 5 extraordinary years, back toward the Atlantic world and the audiences waiting there. Mexico City lay ahead, and beyond it, a crossing to the United States and a meeting with a president who had been watching the progress of this expedition with considerable interest. The notebooks were nearly full. The specimens were packed. The cold current was behind them now, its temperature readings recorded in careful figures that would outlast the journey by centuries. There was still a great deal of continent left to cross. The voyage north from Guayaquil was not simple. The Pacific coast of South America in 1803 was not a place with convenient shipping schedules or reliable passage. Humboldt and Bonpland had to arrange their own transport, negotiate with local officials and manage the considerable logistical problem of moving a scientific expedition, with its instruments, its notebooks, its pressed plant specimens, its boxes of rock samples and preserved animals, from port to port along a coastline that was, in many places, only loosely connected to the administrative machinery of the Spanish Empire. It took time. There were delays. There were moments of waiting in coastal towns while arrangements were made and ships were found and weather was assessed. Humboldt used the time the way he always used time, by observing, measuring, writing and asking questions of anyone who seemed to have useful knowledge about the local geography, economy or natural history. By the spring of 1803, the expedition had made its way to Guayaquil and from there arranged passage north toward New Spain, which is to say toward the territory that would eventually become Mexico. The crossing of the Pacific approaches and the arrival on the Mexican coast brought a new phase of the journey, one that is sometimes underemphasized in accounts of the expedition, but which was, in its own way, just as significant as the years in South America. Mexico in 1803 was the wealthiest and most populous territory in the Spanish colonial empire. It had silver mines that had been producing for nearly 3 centuries. It had a complex social hierarchy. It had a capital city, Mexico City, built on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, that was by some measures larger and more architecturally impressive than most European capitals of the time. Humboldt was not arriving in a backwater. He was arriving at the centre of an empire. He spent roughly a year in New Spain, from early 1803 into early 1804, and the work he did there was different in character from the work he had done in the jungles and mountains of South America. Mexico offered him something the Orinoco could not: archives. The Spanish colonial administration kept meticulous records, population figures, tax receipts, mine production statistics, agricultural yields, trade volumes, and Humboldt was given access to these records in a way that very few foreign visitors ever had been. He spent weeks in Mexico City reading through census data and economic reports, cross-referencing what he read with what he could observe directly by travelling to various parts of the country. He visited the silver mines of Guanajuato, which were at the time among the most productive in the world, producing roughly a third of all the silver being mined globally. He went down into the mines themselves, just as he had gone into the Franconian mines in his early career, measuring, observing and talking to the workers who spent their lives underground. What he found confirmed and deepened the moral and political analysis he had been building since Venezuela. The wealth extracted from New Spain was extraordinary in its scale. The silver alone represented a figure almost incomprehensible to most people of the era, and yet the people doing the actual work of extraction, the indigenous miners, the mestizo labourers, the workers in the agricultural haciendas, lived in conditions of profound poverty and legal vulnerability. The gap between the colonial elite and the working population was not just large, it was structured, deliberate, and maintained by law. Humboldt documented all of this with the same methodical care he brought to measuring ocean temperatures or cataloguing plant species. He was not producing a political pamphlet, he was producing data. But data, presented clearly and honestly, has its own kind of force. The political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, which he would publish in 1811 after his return to Europe, drew directly on the observations and records he gathered during this year in Mexico. It ran to 4 volumes. It contained detailed maps, statistical tables, analyses of agricultural production, population breakdowns by ethnic and legal category, descriptions of the mining economy, and assessments of the trade routes connecting New Spain to both Europe and the Pacific. It was, in its way, the most comprehensive empirical portrait of any colonial territory that had ever been produced. Governments used it. Merchants used it. Reformers used it. When the independence movements of Latin America began gaining momentum in the following decade, Humboldt's political essay was one of the texts that informed the thinking of the people leading those movements, because it gave them a clear-eyed account of what the colonial economy actually looked like and who it actually served. He also found time in Mexico to continue his purely scientific work. He made astronomical observations, took magnetic readings, climbed the volcano Jorullo, which had erupted in 1759, and created a landscape of cooled lava and new cinder cones that fascinated him enormously. He was one of the first scientists to study it systematically. He collected more plants. He examined the ruins of pre-Columbian civilizations and wrote careful descriptions of the architectural and artistic achievements he observed, at a time when most European commentary on indigenous American cultures was either dismissive or superficially romantic. Humboldt tried to look at what was actually there. That was, in the end, his most consistent intellectual habit, trying to see what was actually there, rather than what he expected to find or what was convenient to believe. By early 1804, the expedition was ready to leave the American continent. The plan was to cross the Gulf of Mexico and make a brief stop in the United States before sailing back to Europe. The stop in the United States was not originally a major part of the plan. It was partly a matter of available shipping routes, partly an opportunity that presented itself. But it turned into something more than a stopover. It turned into a series of conversations that would prove unexpectedly consequential. Thomas Jefferson had been following Humboldt's expedition with considerable interest. This was not casual curiosity. Jefferson was, among other things, a serious amateur scientist with genuine intellectual passions in natural history, geography, and the physical sciences. He was also, as President of the United States, intensely interested in the geography of the North American continent, particularly after the Louisiana Purchase of 1803 had dramatically expanded the territory of the young republic. The Lewis and Clark expedition was already underway by the time Humboldt arrived in Washington in May of 1804. Jefferson was thinking hard about the shape of the continent, the nature of the rivers and mountain ranges to the west, and the relationship between North American geography and the political and economic future of the United States. Humboldt, who had spent 5 years systematically studying the geography of the Western Hemisphere and who had access to Spanish colonial maps and surveys that no American official had ever seen, was exactly the kind of visitor Jefferson wanted to talk to. They met multiple times during Humboldt's stay in Washington, which lasted several weeks. The conversations covered an enormous range of subjects. Humboldt shared what he knew about the geography of New Spain's northern territories, the regions that lay adjacent to the Louisiana Purchase lands, the river systems, the mountain ranges, the distances and elevations. He gave Jefferson access to maps and data that the Spanish colonial administration had compiled over decades and which had never been shared with the United States government. Jefferson was, by multiple accounts, deeply impressed. He wrote about Humboldt in his correspondence with notable warmth, describing him as one of the most remarkable men he had ever encountered, a judgment that Jefferson did not make lightly. James Madison was also present at some of these meetings. Madison was then serving as Secretary of State, and the discussions apparently ranged from pure geography into questions of political economy and the long-term development of the American interior. It is worth pausing on this moment for a second, because it is easy to let it pass too quickly. Here was a Prussian scientist, not yet 35 years old, sitting in the capital of a republic that was barely 2 decades old, sharing geographic intelligence about a continent that most of the world still understood only in fragments. The information Humboldt carried in his notebooks and in his memory was, in a very practical sense, more accurate and more detailed than anything the United States government possessed about the lands to its west and south. The conversations in Washington were not just a pleasant exchange between intellectually curious men. They were a transfer of knowledge that had real implications for how the American government understood its own position in the hemisphere. Humboldt also met with other prominent figures during his American visit: scientists, politicians, and members of the American Philosophical Society, which was then the center of American intellectual life. He visited Philadelphia, where he spent time with members of the scientific community and arranged for the shipment of some of his collected materials back to Europe. Philadelphia in 1804 was a busy cosmopolitan city, and Humboldt moved through it with the ease of someone accustomed to navigating elite intellectual circles, which by this point he certainly was. He had spent 5 years in the field, but he had not lost his facility for the salon, the dinner table, the careful conversation with someone who had something interesting to say. By June of 1804, the expedition was ready for the final crossing. Humboldt and Bonpland boarded a ship in Philadelphia and set out across the Atlantic. The voyage back was, compared to everything that had preceded it, uneventful. They arrived in Bordeaux in August of 1804, 5 years and 2 months after setting out from La Coruña. Humboldt was 34 years old. He had travelled approximately 60,000 kilometres. He had collected roughly 60,000 plant, animal and mineral specimens. He had filled dozens of notebooks with observations, measurements and drawings. He had climbed to an altitude no human had documented reaching before. He had confirmed the existence of a geographical feature that European cartographers had debated for decades. He had measured an ocean current, documented an ecosystem of electric eels, observed the deforestation of a Venezuelan lake, descended into silver mines in 3 countries, met with the President of the United States, and written the most detailed economic analysis of a colonial territory that had ever been produced. he was also nearly broke. The expedition had cost an enormous sum. His inheritance, which had seemed substantial in 1799, had been largely consumed by 5 years of travel, instrument purchase, specimen preservation, and the various logistical cost of moving through a continent. He returned to Europe with his notebooks and his specimens and very little else in the way of financial resources. The real expense, as it turned out, was still ahead of him. Publishing the results of the expedition would cost even more than conducting it. But that weight was not yet fully visible in the summer of 1804. What was visible in the days immediately following the return to Bordeaux and then the journey to Paris was the scale of the reception. Humboldt had been known in European scientific circles before the expedition. His mining work and his early publications had established him as a serious figure. But what he returned with was of a different order entirely. Word had been reaching Europe in fragments throughout the 5 years. Letters, preliminary reports, specimens shipped ahead, and the scientific community had been following his progress with growing excitement. His arrival in Paris was treated as a significant event. He was welcomed by the Institut de France, the successor to the old Royal Academy of Sciences, and by the leading figures of French and European natural philosophy. Napoleon, who was then at the height of his power, apparently expressed interest in meeting him, though Humboldt was not particularly enthusiastic about the encounter, having spent 5 years documenting the damage that European imperial power could do to people who had the misfortune of living under it. Paris would become his home for the next 2 decades, and it was in Paris that the enormous work of making sense of everything he had gathered would begin. The notebooks had to be organised, the specimens described and classified, the measurements reduced and analysed, the maps drafted and corrected, the observations written up into publishable form. This was not a task Humboldt could accomplish alone, and he did not attempt to. He assembled a network of collaborators, botanists, zoologists, geologists, astronomers, cartographers, economists, and began parcelling out the material to the specialists best equipped to work with it. Bonpland took primary responsibility for the botanical volumes, working through the plant collections with the painstaking care they required. Other specialists took on the geological and astronomical data. Humboldt himself wrote the narrative and synthesis volumes, the ones that tried to hold everything together and show how the pieces connected. The publishing project that resulted, the Voyage aux régions équinoxiales du Nouveau Continent, would eventually run to 34 volumes and take more than 20 years to complete. It was one of the most ambitious publishing projects in the history of science, and the cost of producing it, with its engraved illustrations and its specialised maps and its multiple parallel volumes in different scientific disciplines, was staggering. Humboldt spent approximately 150,000 francs on the publication alone, a sum that consumed what remained of his personal fortune, and eventually left him financially dependent on the Prussian royal court in his later years. He did not seem to regard this as a tragedy. The work was what mattered. The money was simply what the work required. The publication was not the only thing happening during those Paris years. Humboldt was also, simultaneously, one of the most celebrated intellectual figures in Europe, hosting salons, corresponding with scientists across the continent, mentoring younger researchers, and continuing to think and write at a pace that would have been remarkable for someone half his age. His apartment on the Rue de la Harpe became a gathering point for the scientific and philosophical life of Paris. Young naturalists came to meet him. Artists came to discuss his ideas about the aesthetics of nature. Politicians came to talk about colonial economies and the future of the Americas. He seems to have genuinely enjoyed this life, the combination of rigorous work and rich conversation that Paris in the early 19th century could provide. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, the ideas that had been forming throughout the 5 years of the expedition, the observations about vegetation zones, about climate patterns, about the way living systems were organised and connected, were beginning to crystallise into something larger. The expedition had been the data gathering. What came next was the synthesis. And the synthesis, when it eventually came, would change not just how scientists understood the natural world, but how educated people in general thought about the relationship between living things and the planet they lived on. That part of the story, the intellectual revolution that grew out of those 60,000 kilometres of travel and those dozens of notebooks filled in candlelight and firelight in the open air of the Andes, was still being written. So let us slow down here for a moment and stay with the publishing project, because it is easy to hear 34 volumes and let the number wash over you without really feeling what it meant. 34 volumes, published between 1805 and 1834. Nearly 3 decades of sustained intellectual labour, running in parallel with everything else Humboldt was doing. The salons, the correspondence, the mentoring, the ongoing scientific work. Each volume was not a slim pamphlet. These were substantial, often lavishly illustrated works, produced to the highest standards of scientific publishing that the early 19th century could manage. The botanical volumes alone, the Plantes Equinoxiales and the Nova Generet Species Plantarum that Bonpland co-authored, contained detailed engravings of plants that had never been described in European scientific literature, drawn from the thousands of specimens the two men had collected, pressed, dried, labelled and shipped home over 5 years of fieldwork. The Atlas Géographique et Physique contained maps of a precision and detail that simply had not existed before. The political and economic volumes, including the political essay on the Kingdom of New Spain, offered statistical analysis of population, agriculture, mining output and trade that colonial administrators found immediately useful, even as Humboldt's underlying critique of the colonial system made some of them uncomfortable. The botanical work was particularly enormous in raw numbers. Humboldt and Bonpland had collected approximately 60,000 plant specimens during the expedition. Of those, around 6,000 were species that had not previously been described in European scientific literature. 6,000 new species. The work of formally describing, classifying and illustrating even a fraction of those took decades, and Bonpland in particular devoted much of his later life to it, though he eventually returned to South America and spent his final years in Argentina and Uruguay, working in relative obscurity far from the Paris scientific world he had briefly inhabited. The botanical project was never fully completed in the way Humboldt had originally imagined it. Some of the specimens remained only partially described. Some of the planned volumes were never finished. The sheer volume of material outran even the extraordinary capacity for sustained work that both men possessed. Humboldt's own writing during these decades was not only the expedition narrative. He was producing papers on isotherms, on the distribution of plants, on geomagnetic measurements, on the geology of volcanic regions. He was corresponding with scientists in Russia, in Britain, in the German states, in the United States. He was reading everything published by the next generation of naturalists and responding to it, often with detailed letters that functioned almost as informal peer review. The correspondence alone, across his lifetime, ran to tens of thousands of letters. He wrote quickly and often at night, and seemed to require very little sleep, a trait that impressed and occasionally exhausted the people around him. The Paris salons deserve a little attention of their own, because they were not simply social events. They were intellectual working sessions disguised as dinner parties. Humboldt had a gift for conversation that complemented his gift for observation. He could explain a complex idea clearly, ask a precise question, and draw out the thinking of whoever he was talking to. Scientists came to these gatherings and left with new problems to work on. Artists came and left with new ways of thinking about landscape. Writers came and found their ideas about nature quietly reorganized. The influence was not always direct or traceable, but it was real, and it was wide. One of the people who came into Humboldt's orbit during these years, though not through the salons directly, was a young English naturalist who had not yet done anything particularly remarkable. Charles Darwin read Humboldt's personal narrative, the 7-volume account of the expedition written in Humboldt's own voice, describing the journey from La Coruña to Venezuela, to the Orinoco and beyond, while he was still a student at Cambridge. He did not just read it. He read it obsessively, copying out passages, carrying the volumes with him, reportedly reading sections aloud to his friends. In his autobiography, Darwin later wrote that the personal narrative stirred in him a burning zeal to contribute to the noble structure of natural science. He specifically credited Humboldt as one of the primary reasons he was eager to travel and observe the natural world directly. When the opportunity to sail on the Beagle arrived in 1831, Darwin brought Humboldt's books with him. The observations he made in the Galapagos, on the South American coast, in the tropical forests of Brazil, all of them were shaped, at least in part, by the intellectual framework Humboldt had given him for thinking about how living things related to the environments they inhabited. Darwin is the most famous example, but he was not the only one. The German poet and philosopher Goethe, who was one of the most celebrated figures in European intellectual life in the early 19th century, had a warm and sustained friendship with Humboldt that began before the expedition and continued for decades afterward. Goethe was deeply interested in natural science. He did his own work on plant morphology and colour theory, and he found in Humboldt a kindred spirit who believed that science and art were not separate ways of understanding the world, but complementary ones. Their correspondence was extensive, and Goethe's thinking about nature was visibly shaped by his conversations and letters with Humboldt over the years. Simón Bolívar, who was in the middle of the wars of South American independence during the years when Humboldt was publishing his expedition results, reportedly called Humboldt the true discoverer of South America, because Humboldt had revealed the continent's nature, resources and potential in a way that no previous traveller had managed. This was a significant statement coming from the man who was simultaneously trying to build new nations out of the wreckage of the Spanish colonial system. Humboldt's political essay on New Spain and his similar analyses of Venezuela and Cuba had provided a detailed picture of what the colonial economies actually looked like: the demographics, the agricultural systems, the mineral wealth, the patterns of labour and taxation. That was genuinely useful to people trying to think about what those territories might become once they were no longer under Spanish control. The personal narrative itself is worth pausing on, because it is a genuinely unusual piece of writing. It is not a dry scientific report. It is something closer to what we might now call creative non-fiction, a first-person account of the journey that mixes precise scientific observation with vivid sensory description, personal reflection, and what can only be described as aesthetic response to the natural world. Humboldt writes about the feeling of arriving in the tropics, the overwhelming abundance of life, the quality of the light, the sound of the forest at night, with a directness and a warmth that is quite different from the detached tone of most scientific writing of the period. He was deliberately trying to communicate not just the facts of what he had observed, but the experience of observing it, the sense of being inside a living system of extraordinary complexity and beauty. This was a conscious choice, and it was influential. The idea that scientific writing could be literary, that precision and wonder were not opposites, was not invented by Humboldt, but he demonstrated it at a scale, and with a quality that made it impossible to ignore. The cost of all this publishing, as mentioned, was severe. By the 1820s, Humboldt's personal fortune was essentially gone. He had spent roughly 150,000 francs on the publication of the expedition results, a sum that in modern terms is difficult to translate exactly, but was certainly equivalent to several $1 million by any reasonable estimate. He had also spent freely throughout his Paris years on books, instruments, and the general costs of maintaining the intellectual life he led. He was not reckless or careless. He simply prioritized the work over financial security, consistently and without apparent regret. When the money ran out, he accepted a position at the Prussian royal court in Berlin, working as a chamberlain to King Frederick William III and later Frederick William IV. It was not a role that particularly suited his temperament. He found the ceremonial obligations tedious and the conservative atmosphere of the Prussian court somewhat stifling, but it provided him with a salary that allowed him to continue working, and he took it. He moved between Berlin and Paris for the rest of his long life, maintaining his connections in both cities, continuing to write and correspond and influence. He lived to 89, which in the early 19th century was a remarkable age, and he was working until nearly the end. The final project of his life was Cosmos, an attempt to write a unified description of the entire physical universe, from the structure of the galaxy down to the geography of the Earth and the distribution of life upon it. The first volume appeared in 1845 when Humboldt was 75 years old. It was an immediate success, translated into multiple languages, read by enormous audiences across Europe and North America, praised by scientists and general readers alike. He published 4 more volumes over the following years. He was working on a 5th when he died in May 1859, the same year that Darwin published On the Origin of Species. The timing is worth noting. Darwin's book appeared in November 1859. Humboldt died in May. The 2 great intellectual events of that year, the death of the man who had perhaps done more than anyone else to shape how 19th century science thought about the natural world, and the publication of the theory that would reorganize that thinking at its deepest level, happened within months of each other. It is one of those coincidences that history occasionally produces, and it has a certain quiet rightness to it. Humboldt had spent 60 years building a framework for understanding nature as a connected, dynamic system. Darwin, who had been inspired partly by Humboldt's own writing, provided the mechanism that explained how that system had come to be the way it was. The 34 volumes of the voyage, the 7 volumes of the personal narrative, the 5 volumes of Cosmos, the political essay on New Spain, the dozens of scientific papers, this was the visible output of the expedition, the thing that could be counted and shelved and catalogued. But the actual influence was harder to measure, because it had spread through the thinking of a generation of scientists and writers and political thinkers in ways that were not always acknowledged or even consciously recognized. Ideas about how to look at a landscape, how to think about the relationship between climate and vegetation, how to understand a colonial economy, how to write about the natural world. All of these had been quietly shaped by Humboldt's work, often at several removes, often without the people doing the thinking being entirely aware of the source. The botanical collections eventually found their homes in herbaria across Europe. The geological specimens were distributed to various institutions. The astronomical and magnetic measurements were incorporated into the growing databases of European science. The maps were used, corrected, superseded, and eventually replaced by better maps. But for decades they were the most accurate representations available of large portions of South America. The electric eel observations became standard references in early discussions of bioelectricity. The documentation of the Cassiquiare Canal settled a geographical debate that had been running for half a century. The observations of vegetation zones by altitude became the foundation of a new scientific discipline. The measurements of the cold Pacific current gave oceanographers a baseline that they would build on for the next 2 centuries. None of this happened all at once. It accumulated slowly and unevenly over the decades following the expedition. Some of the results were absorbed quickly into the scientific mainstream. Others sat in the published volumes for years before someone picked them up and realized what they contained. The guano observation, Humboldt's note that the deposits on the Chincha Islands off the Peruvian coast represented an extraordinary agricultural resource, was largely ignored at the time, then rediscovered in the 1840s, and became the basis of a massive international trade that transformed South American economies and European agriculture simultaneously. The deforestation observation at Lake Valencia, which Humboldt had noted as early as 1800 as an example of human activity permanently altering a local climate and hydrology, was ahead of its time by well over a century. Nobody was quite ready to take it seriously when he wrote it. It would take until the late 20th century for that kind of observation to become the centre of global scientific and political attention. What the publishing project accomplished, in the end, was not just the dissemination of specific facts and measurements, though it did that too. It accomplished something more structural. It modelled a way of doing science, synthetic, interdisciplinary, attentive to connections between systems, willing to bring humanistic and aesthetic sensibilities into contact with rigorous empirical method. That was genuinely new. Most science of the period was specialised. Botanists studied plants, geologists studied rocks, astronomers studied the sky. Humboldt studied all of it simultaneously and insisted that the interesting questions were the ones that lived at the boundaries between disciplines, in the relationships between temperature and vegetation, between altitude and species distribution, between colonial economics and ecological damage. That insistence, more than any single discovery, was what made the expedition's legacy last as long as it has. He had gone out to read the Earth as a single living system, as the narration at the very beginning of this story suggested. The publications were his attempt to write down what he had read. And the reading, it turned out, was far from finished, because the ideas he had set in motion were still being developed, still being extended, still being built upon by people who had absorbed his way of seeing, without always knowing where it had come from. The intellectual legacy of the expedition was not a closed book when the last volume of the voyage appeared in 1834. It was, in a sense, still being written. And the most important part of that legacy, the conceptual revolution that would eventually reshape not just science, but the way educated people in general thought about the relationship between humanity and the natural world, was something that Humboldt himself was still working to articulate, right up until the end of his long life and beyond. So what exactly were those ideas? What did Humboldt actually contribute to science, beyond the specific measurements and specimens and maps? This is the question worth sitting with for a while, because the answer is not as simple as listing discoveries. The discoveries were real, and they mattered, but they were almost secondary to something deeper, a shift in the structure of scientific thinking itself that Humboldt introduced, quietly and persistently across decades of work. Begin with biogeography, because it is perhaps the most concrete example. Before Humboldt, naturalists collected plants and animals and catalogued them. They described where a species was found, what it looked like, how it reproduced. What they did not systematically ask was why species were distributed the way they were across the surface of the Earth, why certain plants appeared in certain places and not others, why the flora of a tropical mountain in South America might share structural similarities with the flora of a cold plain in northern Europe, even when the specific species were completely different. Humboldt asked that question, like that. He noticed, travelling through the Andes, that as you climbed in altitude, the vegetation changed in a pattern that was not random. Mosses and lichens near the snow line, shrubby plants just below, dense forest further down. And he noticed that those zones corresponded not to latitude but to temperature and humidity, that the conditions at 4,000 metres in the Ecuadorian Andes produced a climate similar in its essentials to the conditions at sea level in northern Europe, and that the plants growing in both places, though taxonomically distinct, were playing similar ecological roles in similar environmental conditions. This was a genuinely new way of thinking. It meant that geography was not just a backdrop to biology, but an active force shaping it. It meant that you could not understand a species without understanding the environment it inhabited, and you could not understand an environment without understanding the physical conditions: temperature, humidity, altitude, soil, sunlight that defined it. Humboldt laid this out systematically in his Naturgemälde, the great diagram he produced after the expedition, which mapped the vegetation zones of Chimborazo by altitude and annotated each zone with its characteristic plants, its temperature, its atmospheric pressure, its relationship to similar zones elsewhere in the world. It was, in a sense, the first ecological map. He called it a nature picture, and that is exactly what it was. A portrait of nature as a system rather than a collection of parts. The isotherms came out of the same impulse. In 1817, Humboldt published a paper in which he introduced the concept of connecting points of equal mean temperature on a map with a continuous line. He called these lines isotherms. The idea sounds simple now, because we see isotherm maps all the time on weather forecasts and climate charts. But before Humboldt, no one had done it. Temperature had been measured in individual places, but those measurements had not been connected into a global pattern. Humboldt's isotherms revealed for the first time visually that temperature on the Earth's surface was not simply a function of latitude, that the isotherms bent and curved in response to ocean currents, altitude, and continental land masses, that the climate of London and the climate of a city at the same latitude in the interior of Russia were dramatically different, and that the difference could be mapped and explained. This was the beginning of climatology as a systematic discipline. The paper was 14 pages long. Its consequences took decades to fully unfold. Then there is the matter of ecology itself, a word that did not yet exist when Humboldt was doing his most important work. The German biologist Ernst Haeckel coined the term in 1866, 7 years after Humboldt's death. But the intellectual substance of what Haeckel was naming had been articulated by Humboldt across decades of writing. The idea that living organisms exist in dynamic relationship with each other and with their physical environment, that these relationships form systems with their own patterns and regularities, that disturbing one element of a system produces effects that ripple through the whole. All of this is present in Humboldt's work, clearly and explicitly, from the earliest publications onward. Haeckel gave it a name. Humboldt had given it a method and a body of evidence. And then there is the Lake Valencia observation, which deserves particular attention because it is, in a very real sense, the first documented scientific description of what we now call anthropogenic environmental change. Humboldt visited Lake Valencia in Venezuela in 1800, early in the expedition. He noticed that the lake level had dropped significantly from what local accounts described. He investigated the likely causes and concluded that the clearing of forests around the lake for agriculture had altered the local hydrology, that the trees, which had previously absorbed rainfall and released it slowly into the watershed, had been removed, causing increased runoff, decreased groundwater recharge, and a net loss of water from the lake system. He wrote about this explicitly. He noted that human activity had permanently altered the local climate and water cycle. He warned that the same process, if continued, would produce further degradation. This observation was made in 1800. It was published in the political essay on New Spain and in the personal narrative. It was read by educated Europeans and Americans throughout the first half of the 19th century. And it was, by and large, not taken seriously as a warning, because the intellectual and economic framework of the time had no place for the idea that human activity could meaningfully damage the natural world at a systemic level. The assumption was that nature was vast and resilient and essentially self-correcting. Humboldt was suggesting something different, that nature was a system, that systems had thresholds, and that human activity was already crossing some of those thresholds in observable ways. It would take another 150 years for that suggestion to become the centre of global scientific and political concern. But it was there, in his writing, from the very beginning of the 19th century. His influence on the people who came after him is sometimes easier to trace than the influence of his abstract ideas, because the personal connections are documented. Darwin is the most important case. Darwin read the personal narrative before the Beagle voyage. He later described it as one of the books that most shaped his intellectual development. He carried Humboldt's volumes with him on the Beagle. He wrote in his diary about arriving in tropical Brazil and feeling that he was finally seeing what Humboldt had described. The experience of the natural world as an interconnected system, the attention to distribution patterns, the willingness to ask why species were where they were rather than just cataloguing that they were there. All of this was part of what Darwin absorbed from Humboldt, and all of it fed into the intellectual background from which the theory of natural selection eventually emerged. Darwin never claimed Humboldt as a direct source for the theory itself, and he was right not to, because Humboldt did not have evolution. But he had the habit of mind that made evolution imaginable. John Muir, the Scottish-American naturalist who essentially founded the American conservation movement in the late 19th century, carried Humboldt's books with him into the Sierra Nevada. He annotated them heavily. His way of writing about wilderness as something with its own integrity and logic something that deserved protection not merely for human benefit, but for its own sake, owes a clear debt to Humboldt's vision of nature as a unified, self-organizing system. Henry David Thoreau read the personal narrative and took notes on it extensively. His copy, with his annotations, still exists. The language of Walden, with its careful attention to the relationships between weather and vegetation and animal behaviour, reflects a sensibility that Humboldt had helped to form. Simón Bolívar called Humboldt the true discoverer of South America, meaning not the geographical discovery, which had happened 3 centuries earlier, but the scientific and intellectual discovery, the first systematic attempt to understand what the continent actually was in terms of its natural systems, its peoples, its resources, and its potential. Bolívar had met Humboldt in Paris before the expedition and again afterward, and the political essay on New Spain, which contained detailed analyses of colonial economic structures, taxation systems, and the conditions of indigenous and enslaved populations, was read by independence leaders across Latin America as a kind of scientific argument for why the colonial system was not just politically unjust, but economically irrational and environmentally destructive. Humboldt had not intended the essay as a revolutionary document, but it functioned as one, in part because it provided detailed empirical evidence for arguments that independence advocates were already making on philosophical and moral grounds. Goethe is a different kind of case. The two men met in Jena in 1794 before the expedition, and maintained a friendship and intellectual correspondence for decades afterward. Goethe was working on his own theory of nature, a more aesthetic and intuitive approach than Humboldt's empirical method, but pointing in some of the same directions. Both men believed that the natural world had an underlying unity, that its diversity was an expression of deeper organizing principles, that understanding nature required something more than analytical dissection. They disagreed about method and about the role of mathematics and measurement, but they recognized in each other a shared fundamental orientation. Goethe later said that Humboldt had given him more understanding of nature in a few hours of conversation than he had gained from years of his own study. This is probably an exaggeration, as Goethe was prone to, but it captures something real about the quality of Humboldt's mind, his ability to synthesize enormous quantities of detailed observation into a coherent, communicable vision. The Cosmos project, which occupied the last 2 decades of Humboldt's life, was the fullest expression of that vision. He began delivering the lectures that would eventually become the Cosmos volumes in Berlin in 1827, when he was 58 years old. The lectures were open to the public, unusually so for the period, and drew audiences that included not just scientists and academics, but artisans, soldiers, women, students. Several thousand people attended the full lecture series. Humboldt insisted on the open access deliberately. He believed that scientific understanding of the natural world was not the property of specialists. It belonged to everyone, and it was the responsibility of scientists to make it available in forms that anyone could engage with. The published Cosmos volumes, which began appearing in 1845, were an attempt to do in writing what the lectures had done in person. The first volume described the physical universe from the scale of galaxies down to the surface of the Earth. The second volume examined how human beings had perceived and represented the natural world across history, through art, through poetry, through landscape painting, through the development of botanical gardens and natural history collections. The third and fourth volumes dealt with the specific physical systems of the Earth, the atmosphere, the oceans, the magnetic field, the distribution of volcanic activity. The fifth volume, unfinished at his death, was intended to address the organic world, plants, animals, the distribution of life across the planet's surface. The Cosmos was a bestseller. The first volume sold out its initial print run within 2 months. It was translated into French, English, Spanish, Italian, Dutch, and several other languages within a few years of publication. Ordinary readers bought it and read it. This was not common for scientific literature in the 1840s. Humboldt had managed to write about science in a way that was technically rigorous, but also genuinely readable. that conveyed not just the facts, but the experience of understanding, the feeling of seeing the world suddenly make sense in a new way. He had been working toward that quality of writing his entire adult life, and in the Cosmos he came closest to achieving it. What he was arguing for in the Cosmos and in everything he had written since the expedition was a particular way of understanding the relationship between humanity and the natural world, not the relationship of mastery and exploitation that the colonial economies of his era embodied, not the relationship of pure aesthetic appreciation that Romanticism sometimes fell into, something more demanding and more honest than either, a relationship of attentive understanding grounded in detailed empirical knowledge but open to the full complexity and interconnection of natural systems. He believed that if people truly understood how the natural world worked, how its systems were connected, how human activity was already altering those systems in measurable ways, they would necessarily feel a different kind of responsibility toward it. Not guilt, exactly. More like the responsibility that comes with knowledge. The responsibility of someone who's been shown how something works and can no longer claim ignorance as an excuse. Whether he was right about that is a question the 21st century is still working out. The evidence is mixed, but the argument itself, that scientific understanding of nature is not separate from ethical responsibility toward it, that ecology and ethics are connected at a fundamental level, is one that traces a clear line back to Humboldt's expedition, to the observations he made in Venezuela and Peru and Ecuador, to the conclusions he drew from those observations, and to the decades of writing through which he tried to make those conclusions available to anyone willing to read them. By the time of his death in May 1859, Humboldt had been working on the 5th volume of Cosmos for several years. He did not finish it. The manuscript was incomplete. His writing desk in Berlin was covered with notes and drafts. He was 89 years old and had been working with only brief interruptions for more than 60 years. The ideas he had set in motion were by then thoroughly embedded in the scientific culture of Europe and North America, often without his name attached to them, often without the people using those ideas being aware of where they had originated. Which is, in a way, the highest form of intellectual influence, when an idea becomes so fundamental to the way people think that it no longer needs to be attributed to anyone. It simply becomes part of how the world is understood. And yet, for all of that, something curious happened in the decades after his death. His name did not disappear. It was attached to too many things for that to be possible. But his reputation in the English-speaking world began to fade. The reasons for that fading are worth sitting with, and they open a question that carries the story forward into the 20th century and into our own time. There is something almost ironic about the way Humboldt's reputation eroded in the English-speaking world. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The way a shoreline retreats, so slowly that you only notice it when you look at where the water used to be. Through the late 19th century, he was still widely celebrated. His death in 1859 had prompted mourning on multiple continents. In the United States, centennial celebrations of his birth in 1869 drew enormous crowds in New York, Boston, and cities across the country. Statues were erected. Parks were named. There was a genuine public sense that this man had mattered, that his work had changed something fundamental about how the world was understood. And then, slowly, the recognition began to thin. Part of what happened was simply the natural drift of intellectual history. Science became increasingly specialized through the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and Humboldt's great strength, his insistence on synthesis, on seeing everything together, became less legible to a scientific culture that was moving in the opposite direction. The disciplines he had helped to found, including biogeography, ecology, and climatology, developed their own traditions and their own founding figures, and Humboldt's role in those origins became harder to see from inside each individual field. He was too broad to be claimed fully by any single discipline, and so no single discipline made the effort to keep his name central. There was also, it has to be said, a language problem. Humboldt wrote primarily in French and German. His great expedition narrative, The personal narrative of travels to the equinoctial regions of America was translated into English, but many of his other works were not widely available in English translation, or were translated in forms that did not capture the quality of his prose. The Cosmos volumes were translated, but the translations were uneven, and by the mid-20th century even those versions had gone out of print. For an English-speaking reader who wanted to actually encounter Humboldt's own writing, the path was not easy. And if the writing is not accessible, the reputation tends to drift. Then there was the particular way the 20th century organised its scientific heroes: Einstein, Darwin, Newton, figures who could be attached to a single transformative idea, a single famous moment, a single clean narrative of discovery. Humboldt did not fit that template. His contribution was not one idea, but hundreds of ideas. Not one discovery, but a way of seeing that made many discoveries possible. That is harder to explain in a sentence, harder to teach in a classroom, harder to turn into a poster or a commemorative stamp. The century that produced the soundbite was not well equipped to honour the kind of mind that required a 34-volume expedition report to begin expressing itself. And so, for much of the 20th century, Humboldt occupied a strange position, enormously present in the physical landscape of the world, in the names of places and species and currents and counties, but surprisingly absent from the cultural conversation about science and its history. His name was everywhere. His ideas were everywhere. But the man himself, the story of what he had actually done and thought and argued, had become strangely obscure. The count of things named after Humboldt is, depending on how you tally it, somewhere above 300. There is the Humboldt Current, the cold upwelling along the western coast of South America that he measured from a small boat off the Peruvian coast in 1802, running at roughly 16 degrees Celsius, while the surrounding Pacific sat 10 degrees warmer. The current drives one of the most productive marine ecosystems on Earth. The cold, nutrient-rich water supports enormous populations of anchovies, which in turn support the seabirds and marine mammals of the South American coast. The guano deposits that Humboldt observed on the Chincha Islands, and whose agricultural potential he correctly predicted, were a product of those same seabird populations, which were themselves a product of that same current. Everything connected. There is the Humboldt penguin, Spheniscus humboldti, a medium-sized penguin that lives along the Peruvian and Chilean coast, and depends directly on the cold water of the current for its food supply. There is the Humboldt squid, Dosidicus gigas, a large and somewhat alarming deep-water squid that also inhabits the current's range and has been expanding northward in recent decades as ocean temperatures shift, a migration that Humboldt, with his interest in how species distributions respond to environmental conditions, might have found grimly instructive. In the United States there is Humboldt County in California, in the far northwest of the state, a place of coastal redwoods and fog, and a particular quality of green light that seems appropriate to carry his name. There is Humboldt Bay, which the county surrounds. There are towns named Humboldt in Kansas, Tennessee, Iowa, Nebraska, and Saskatchewan. There is Humboldt Peak in Colorado, one of the state's 14ers, standing at 4,290 meters. There is a Humboldt Glacier in Greenland, a Humboldt mountain range in Nevada, a Humboldt River that crosses most of northern Nevada and then simply disappears into the desert. The river's disappearance into what is called the Humboldt Sink feels, if you're in a certain mood, like a small geographical joke about the difficulty of containing the man's legacy in any one place. All of this naming was deliberate. It was a form of tribute, carried out over decades by explorers, cartographers, naturalists and governments who understood that Humboldt had done something that deserved to be remembered at a geographical scale. But a name on a map is a quiet form of memory. It does not tell you why the name is there, or what the person did, or what they were thinking when they stood in the place that now carries their name. For that, you need the story. The story came back into focus, at least for English-speaking readers, in 2015, when the writer Andrea Wolff published The Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World. It was not the first biography of Humboldt in English, but it was the most accessible, the most beautifully written, and the most carefully constructed to show not just what Humboldt did, but why it mattered. Why his way of seeing the world was not just historically interesting, but urgently relevant to the questions the 21st century was trying to answer. The book became a genuine literary event. It won the Royal Society Science Book Prize. It was translated into more than 24 languages. It introduced Humboldt to a generation of readers who had never encountered his name except, perhaps, on a map of Northern California or in a nature documentary about South American wildlife. Wolff's central argument was simple and powerful. Humboldt had invented, or at least articulated with more clarity and force than anyone before him, a way of understanding nature as a web of interconnections rather than a collection of separate objects. He had seen, from his earliest observations in Venezuela, that you could not understand a plant without understanding the soil it grew in, the climate that shaped that soil, the elevation that determined that climate, the geological history that had produced that elevation. Everything was connected to everything else, and the connections were not incidental but essential. They were what the system actually was. To study any part of it in isolation was to misunderstand it. This sounds obvious now. It sounds obvious because Humboldt spent 60 years making it obvious, and the scientists who came after him built it into the foundations of ecology, biogeography and climate science so thoroughly that it became invisible as an assumption, simply part of how the disciplines thought. Darwin is the clearest example of the debt. Darwin read Humboldt's personal narrative as a young man and was, by his own account, transformed by it. He copied long passages into his notebooks. He carried the book with him on the Beagle voyage. He described Humboldt as the person who had first ignited in him the desire to visit the tropics, to see for himself the natural abundance that Humboldt had described with such precision and such feeling. The theory of natural selection, which Darwin developed over the following decades, depended on exactly the kind of careful biogeographical thinking that Humboldt had pioneered. The observation that species distributions are not random but follow environmental patterns, that populations change in response to environmental pressures, that geography and biology are inseparable. Darwin acknowledged the debt explicitly and repeatedly. Without Humboldt, the Beagle voyage might not have happened. Without the Beagle voyage, On the Origin of Species might not have been written, or might have been written differently, or might have been written much later. The intellectual lineage is not certain, but it is real. John Muir, the Scottish-American naturalist who more than anyone else established the American conservation movement, and whose advocacy led directly to the creation of Yosemite and Sequoia national parks, carried Humboldt's books with him into the Sierra Nevada. He annotated them heavily. His way of writing about wilderness as a living system of interconnections rather than a scenic backdrop for human experience was directly descended from Humboldt's approach. Henry David Thoreau, who had his own copy of the personal narrative and read it carefully, drew on Humboldt's ideas about the relationship between climate, vegetation, and the character of a landscape in his own writing about Walden Pond and the New England countryside. Thoreau was not a tropical traveller. He famously did not go very far. But his way of paying attention to the specific place he inhabited, of treating the local as a window onto the universal, owed something to Humboldt's demonstration that careful observation anywhere could reveal the deep patterns of the natural world. Simón Bolívar, who led the independence movements that freed much of South America from Spanish colonial rule, had met Humboldt in Paris in 1804 and carried the encounter with him for the rest of his life. Bolívar later said that Humboldt had done more for the Americas than all the conquistadors combined, that Humboldt had revealed the true nature of the continent to the world, had given it back its own reality in place of the distorted image that colonial administration had imposed. This is a large claim, and Bolívar was not a man inclined toward understatement, but it captures something genuine about the political weight of Humboldt's work. His careful, sympathetic documentation of the lands and peoples of Spanish America, his explicit condemnation of slavery and colonial exploitation, his insistence that the indigenous populations of the Americas were not obstacles to civilization, but participants in it. These were not neutral scientific positions. They were arguments, and they carried force. Humboldt died on May 6, 1859, in Berlin. He was 89 years old. He had been working that morning, as he worked most mornings, on the 5th volume of Cosmos. The manuscript was on his desk. He had been corresponding with scientists and scholars across Europe and North America until just weeks before his death, still curious, still engaged, still following the development of ideas that had begun with observations he had made 60 years earlier in Venezuela and Ecuador and Peru. He had outlived almost everyone who had known him as a young man. Bonpland, his companion on the expedition, had died the previous year in South America, where he had spent most of his adult life after returning from Europe, still collecting plants, still sending specimens back to institutions in Paris and Berlin. The two men had corresponded for decades, a long, quiet thread connecting the expedition's present to its past. The 5th volume of Cosmos was never finished. The notes and drafts on Humboldt's desk were eventually published in a partial form, but the work remained incomplete. There is something fitting about that, though it is the kind of fitting that is easier to see in retrospect than it was to experience at the time. The natural world that Humboldt had spent his life trying to describe in its full interconnected complexity was not the kind of subject that admitted of a final volume. It kept changing, kept revealing new connections, kept generating new questions. He had known this. One of the things he had understood, earlier and more clearly than most of his contemporaries, was that the work of understanding nature was not a project with an endpoint, but a process, ongoing, self-correcting, always incomplete, always moving toward a comprehension that remained just slightly beyond reach. The unfinished Cosmos was not a failure. It was an accurate representation of the subject. What the expedition itself represents, looked at from the distance of more than 2 centuries, is something that is harder to name but important to sit with. It was not simply a collecting trip, as Humboldt had insisted before he ever left La Coruña. It was not simply an adventure, though it was certainly that. It was an attempt, sustained over 5 years, across tens of thousands of kilometres, through conditions that were frequently dangerous and often genuinely miserable, to see the world as a whole. To hold the details and the patterns together at the same time. To measure the temperature of an ocean current and understand that the temperature was not just a number, but a fact about how the entire system of life along that coast was organised. To climb a mountain and understand that the bands of vegetation changing with altitude were not just botanical curiosities, but a demonstration of the same principles that governed the distribution of life across the entire surface of the planet. That way of seeing, synthetic, interconnected, attentive to relationships rather than just to objects, is the intellectual gift the expedition gave to science, and it is, as it happens, the way of seeing that the present moment most urgently needs. The environmental questions of the 21st century are not questions that can be answered by any single discipline working in isolation. They require exactly the kind of thinking Humboldt practiced. The ability to hold climate, ecology, geology, economics, and human behaviour in mind simultaneously, to trace the connections between them, to understand that changing one part of the system changes everything else. He arrived at that understanding by spending 5 years paying very close attention to a part of the world that most European scientists had never seen. The attention came first, the understanding followed. There is something quietly worth noticing about the places that still carry his name. The Humboldt Current is not named after him because of sentiment. It is named after him because he measured it, described it, and understood its significance. Understood that this cold river flowing through the Pacific was not just a temperature anomaly, but a driver of the entire ecology of the western coast of South America. Every time the name appears on a map or in a scientific paper, It is a small reminder that the world's systems were not always understood, that someone had to go and measure them and think carefully about what the measurements meant, that the understanding we now take for granted was once an achievement. If you're listening to this tonight, wherever you are, whatever the temperature is outside your window, whatever the season is doing to the trees or the sky or the street, you're inside a system. The air has a humidity and a pressure and a temperature that connect it to the air everywhere else. The plants outside, if there are plants, are growing at an elevation that partly determines what they are. The water in the ground beneath you has a history that connects it to rainfall patterns shaped by ocean temperatures thousands of kilometers away. Humboldt would have wanted to measure all of it. He would have wanted to know how it connected to everything else. He would have found it interesting, genuinely, openly, almost helplessly interesting, the way some people simply cannot help finding the world interesting no matter how long they have been paying attention to it. He spent 60 years paying attention, and he still had a 5th volume left to write. That seems about right. The world is exactly that large. Thank you for spending this time with us here at Life Beyond Seen. If this journey through one of history's great expeditions has stayed with you tonight, a like or a subscription means more than you might think. It helps this channel keep making these long, quiet explorations for the people who need them. Rest well wherever you are.